Thank you.
Sí. Bueno, buenos días. Ya todos están en su interpretación, imagino, en el canal en español. La primera instrucción es que cuando van a hablar, enciendan sus micrófonos y permanezcan con ellos apagados durante el taller, si no están hablando, para facilitar la interpretación de Pamela y Luis, que van a trabajar esta mañana con nosotros, interpretando de inglés a español. Tengo el agrado de presentarles y un agradecimiento muy grande a Michelle y David por haber aceptado hacer este taller, y los voy a dejar con ellos durante esta mañana. Ellos ya saben que ustedes están trabajando en un proyecto de innovación educativa y van a trabajar de forma personalizada con ustedes, así que aprovechen de hacer todas las preguntas que tenían con respecto a la plataforma. Y les agradezco enormemente nuevamente, Michelle y David, porque esto abrió paso a este nuevo proyecto y vemos los frutos de lo que ustedes iniciaron el año pasado, y esta vez va a quedar grabado, así que esperamos que pueda ser el inicio también de nuevas colaboraciones de trabajo entre equipos, entre universidades y entre nosotros. Muchísimas gracias.
Well, thank you very much for having us. We're looking forward to kind of sharing a bit more about what we know and helping you get started on your projects. So I'll just share my screen. Okay. So this morning, we are going to talk a bit about designing virtual scenarios for meaningful learning. And this presentation is a collaboration of the development and learning of Dr. David Tropps, Dr. Rachel Ellaway, who were presenting last year too, and myself. There we go. So as we are in Calgary, I'd just like to take a minute to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in Southern Alberta. And the city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. So both David and I work for the University of Calgary. I'm a nursing instructor in the Faculty of Nursing and have been using Open Labyrinth with our students since 2013. So I'm excited to kind of share some of what we've done and the effectiveness of that, and hopefully help you to create great projects. So I am receiving consulting fees for this workshop. And then David is the professor of family medicine in the Cumming School of Medicine, as well at the University of Calgary, and he has no conflict of interest to declare. So we have worked together for quite some time, and so there will be parts of this presentation where David will also share his expertise in working with this product. So I thought we would start with kind of what is meaningful learning. Oh, actually, I'm going to start back for a second, the agenda. And so I thought maybe we could do some introductions, actually. So if maybe you could just share your name and your area of interest, I think that would give us a good start for kind of maybe what you're working on today. So maybe we can just go around and you can unmute yourself and just share your name and what you're working on.
Hola, buenos días. Mi nombre es María Paz Marín. Muchos de los que estamos aquí participando somos médicos veterinarios y, por supuesto, el área de interés es poder desarrollar algún caso clínico en el área de medicina veterinaria, donde en general no hay mucho, precisamente utilizando la plataforma. Así que aprovecho de agradecerles también esta oportunidad.
Hola, también me presento, Óscar López, médico veterinario, y mi área de interés es la patología y la fisiopatología animal.
Hola,
Francisca.
buenos días. Mi nombre es Francisca Fonseca. También soy médico veterinario y mi área de interés es el área de medicina de rumiantes. Y tal como decía María Paz, la idea es generar casos clínicos que puedan acercar lo que vemos en terreno hacia los estudiantes. Gracias.
Hola, buenos días. Mi nombre es Andrés Villegas. Yo soy ingeniero agrónomo. Mi área de expertise actualmente es trabajo en terreno, sobre todo mediciones con todo tipo de sensores. Entonces, queremos tratar de trabajar con los alumnos y aplicar casos que los puedan acercar en esta parte del aprender haciendo. Entonces, súper interesante para nosotros poder participar. Y le agradezco a ustedes.
Voy a presentar a uno de los integrantes que todavía ha tenido problemas con su PC para conectarse, pero que me parece bueno presentarlo ahora. Él es Víctor Chackels, también veterinario, y que va a participar del taller, y su área de interés es la medicina y clínica de los caballos, de los equinos, sobre todo cuando él trabaja con caballos de carrera, fina sangre de carrera, y su idea también es poder elaborar casuística interactiva como material docente. Gracias.
Hola. Hola, buenos días. No sé si me oyen.
¿Sí? ¿Se te escucha?
¿Me escucha?
Sí. Ya, buenos días. Mi nombre es Anet Gárate. Yo soy profesora en informática educativa. Estoy dentro de este equipo como la diseñadora instruccional y estoy muy interesada en conocer la metodología y la herramienta que tienen para presentarnos. Gracias.
So I've been trying to keep track of the names on the screen and who's had a chance. Is there anyone who hasn't had a chance to introduce themselves? Okay. So we will continue. My area of expertise in nursing is addictions and mental health. So it's quite different than your expertise and areas that you're interested in that will be developing cases, but hopefully today we can give you some basic tools to be able to help you create the learning materials that you would like to. So we are going to do an overview of designing virtual scenarios for meaningful learning. Hopefully, I'd like to have an opportunity for you to share more about your projects and how we can help you, and potentially even maybe go work in some breakout rooms, and then we'll wrap up and talk about next steps that might be helpful. As with many terms in academia, there are specific meanings associated with meaningful learning. So ASA will use the term meaningful learning to refer to the learning process and outcomes when prior knowledge is related to and incorporated into learners' cognitive structures. And Novak later stated that meaningful learning underlines the constructive integration of thinking, feeling, and acting, leading to empowerment for commitment and responsibility. So for the purposes of this presentation, we want to consider how teachers can design virtual scenarios to cultivate the integration of cognitive, affective, and behavioral learning to creatively solve real-world problems. So a few principles of meaningful learning. One, it's active. So learners must cognitively engage in the material. So it must be relevant and interesting. It's constructive. So students are going to apply what they already know to new contexts. And in doing so, they'll develop new knowledge. So an example from our practice is students who need to do a sterile procedure. And if they lose sterility for one of their hands, to figure out how they can complete the task with what they have or how they would acquire other resources. So this could be new gloves, this could be maybe having someone come and help them. So it's really kind of taking the knowledge that they have about completing a sterile procedure and building on that when it doesn't go right. So in this way, it's somewhat cumulative as well. And it's also self-regulated. So meaningful learning is an independent process. People go develop this learning and learn things at different levels on their own time. But this does not mean that meaningful learning occurs in isolation. So rather, the process of constructing learning occurs differently for each person. So the impact of the consequences, the different past experiences they bring are all going to impact the connections that they make as they learn. And of course, meaningful learning is goal-oriented. We have expected outcomes, and students also, through this process, in terms of how they make these connections, develop their own goals. So what are virtual patients? So that's an interactive computer simulation of real-life clinical scenarios for the purpose of healthcare and medical training, education, and assessment. So while this definition is specific to virtual patients, we acknowledge that our virtual scenarios do not include just patients. So sometimes our definition of patients is broader. It can include pets, for example. But sometimes our situations are more about interactions between team members or interactions with equipment. And it can also include developing outcomes related to processes. So how do we go about accomplishing a task when there's variability or when it doesn't align with our nice, clean, sanitized textbook examples? So Open Labyrinth is a platform, and we use this to create meaningful learning opportunities for learners. And while many virtual scenario products provide the opportunities listed on this slide, the OLAB platform is unique in that it provides learners with opportunities to make decisions and experience consequences in a safe environment. So for example, when learners can experience the trajectory and the consequences of their choices, they are cognitively engaged in constructing knowledge that is connected to their behavior. And in our experience in nursing, when learning is mediated by a screen in this way, like a virtual scenario, the students have also told us that they had time to reflect on their own emotions and consider how these connect to personal and professional values, beliefs, and biases. And then they continue to reflect on how these values, beliefs, and biases impact their clinical practice. As well, the branching narratives mean that students can play the same case several times and continue to develop new knowledge each time they play the case, because their choices and responses will be different within the case and lead them down different paths of learning. So for the rest of this presentation, I'd like to talk about some design options for unfolding narratives and a few other options that we have used to successfully engage learners. So first we'll talk about unfolding narratives, and the examples I'm going to show you are just a few of the options. Really, how you organize and branch out these stories are up to kind of how you creatively see these stories unfold in clinical practice. So in this first example, learners all start from the same point. They can make different choices, but would meet at common points throughout the case. This is a more linear case design, and it's useful if you want learners to have some choice, the consequences are not dire, and there's a broader common outcome that you want learners to achieve. In this type of design, learners might start with a basic case, but they can be directed to other cases depending upon their performance. So this type of branching narrative really allows for more individualized and scaffolded learning. So when you have learners at different points in the same class, they can experience different levels of learning without a whole lot of extra work for the teacher. Next, we might want to create a cluster of cases about a certain topic. Some advantages of using this approach is that learners can explore various complexities about a topic in a non-specific order. As learners play through the scenarios in different orders, they explore the topic from different perspectives. So in this situation, students might make assumptions about the topic after they play through one case, but these assumptions may be challenged as they learn about the topic from other perspectives. So it's a way of building complexity and thinking about a problem from many perspectives and weighing the choices or the interventions you make based on kind of what is going to be best in that scenario or other factors you need to think about. In this example, the virtual scenario connects two external learning activities. So an example might be a scaffolded learning activity where the triangle could represent a paper and pencil assignment, which prepares the student for the virtual scenario. And then the virtual scenario could be practice for when the students might do a standardized patient simulation represented by the purple shape. Another way that this might occur is for a learner to start and end this series with a high fidelity simulation. So in this example, then the results from the first high fidelity simulation represented by the triangle become the starting point for the virtual simulation. And then they can make choices and explore different ways to solve the problem. However, then how the learner performs in the virtual scenario then determines the difficulty of the final high fidelity simulation. So for example, if there were diagnostic, not criteria, but if there were diagnostic tests and things at the end of the virtual scenario, that kind of data could then be programmed into a high fidelity simulation, and the student could carry on with the scenario from where they left off. So if they were performed well, the high fidelity scenario might be easier. If they did not perform well in the high fidelity scenario, their patient may be more acutely sick, and they would have to manage that in a different way. I think I might just pause there and see if there's any questions about kind of unfolding narratives before we go on to some of the other options. Okay. Okay. I will just go back here. Okay, so I think that going forward, we're going to explore some other options that we've used for engaging learners. And these include different types of questions, audio-visual add-ins, and real-time chat sessions. So to provide some context for some of the different types of questions that you can use, I thought we could start with a story. And this is just a simple fairy tale because it's all familiar to us. And I will definitely jump into the more complex topics that you have when we start working on your projects. So I'll just give you a minute to read this. So basically, we have a king whose princess daughter is missing and a prince who has been commissioned by the king to find her. So this is an example of a single answer multiple choice. And in OLab, we call these a pick choice. The benefits of this is that we can provide immediate feedback to students. So we can either just show them that the answer is right or wrong, as evidenced by the check mark and the X, or we can actually also provide some short feedback. So for example, answer A, you will risk death to save his daughter. And this is the correct answer because it's the honorable thing to do. This is an example of a select all that apply. And so this is when there may be, these are helpful when there are components to the answer that kind of maybe work together or kind of form a complex idea around an intervention perhaps. So again, we have the option to reveal the answers and provide feedback. These types of questions can be done by just creating a multiple choice type question. And again, you can show the answer or not, and you can provide short feedback. Sometimes we have the answers to these, whether it's right or wrong, require longer explanations or rationales. So it provides the context for the answer, or because there may be some variability. And we would use those by creating what we call a dandelion. And we can show you these things in Open Labyrinth. So we've also used matching questions. And so these are helpful for various other situations. So for example, definitions, when we want to learners to create or to match attributes to certain things. So diagnostic criteria might be one, as well as expected outcomes. So this can really we can give learners multiple attempts to answer this. So if they don't get it right the first time, they can click the button that says try again, and they can keep trying till they get the right answer. But we can also at the end show them what the correct answer is. They just click on another button that would say show me the answer. So these are features that we can either enable or disable based on the type of assessment that you want to do. And then we have an example of an ordering or prioritizing question. So again, this is kind of a drag and drop into the right order. And these are really good when we want students to prioritize what would be most important, or perhaps the best order to complete a task in. And the important thing here is that they're not just picking the best answer. The order of the second, third, and fourth choices are just as important as the first choice. So we can't just choose the best answer and then not give consideration to how the choices we would make to complete that task. So I haven't put an answer to this question because I suspect the choices might be a bit controversial. So for audiovisual add-ins, some of the examples are we can include short videos, voice recordings. So if for example, some of our students, we want them to hear what the patient sounds like so they can interpret tone of voice, or determine if the tone of voice is actually congruent with what the person is saying. We can include voice recordings and pictures. So we have recently done some more work on a project for Simulation Canada, where some of our participants who are creating scenarios like this are putting in pictures of slides, so pathology. They're being asked how to use certain equipment to complete tests and procedures on samples. And so some of these audiovisual add-ins are helpful for that. So pictures in particular might be helpful for when we need learners to pick up on visual cues, such as maybe that bridge is a picture that we include when the prince is deciding whether he wants to take on this task or not. That looks a little daunting maybe. And so it adds some complexity to the decision that the prince needs to make. Some of these add-ins as well are also helpful when we want to get at potential biases of our learners. So for example, we might want to put in the picture of Prince Charming because it's not a warrior prince at all. It's actually this green toad in the swamp. And so there are these, picking up on these biases and finding ways to include activities that highlight these for students are really important for when they go into clinical practice in terms of how they then interact as well as formulate solutions. So when conversations arise in practice, some of them depend upon the nuances of human interaction. And so we have we can include real-time chats within these scenarios as well. And so this is when the learner chats by text with the facilitator who assumes the role of the virtual patient or whatever other role they're assuming, and they receive a real-time response. We have inquired with our learners about if they would like to do voice to text dictation, and actually they wanted to stick with the text. So we can do voice to text dictation in some scenarios, but they really enjoyed the text. And the reason for this is because it gave them time to actually think about what they were going to say, type it in, review their answer, and if they didn't like it, they could hit delete and try again. And so it was the fact that it had offered them time to think that was really helpful in particular. So during these conversations, learners participate in how the situation unfolds and solutions are created in more of a real-time scenario. So this is a dynamic process that requires students to formulate their own responses and use communication skills to adapt to the unique circumstances of the situation. I don't think I have ever been in clinical practice where my patient or my colleagues or provide multiple choice answers. I always have to formulate the ideas and the concepts in my own words. And that is one thing that, particularly in mental health and addictions, that our students are afraid of. How do they ask about suicide and risk, kind of some of those more sensitive topics? And so this gives them an opportunity then to put those concepts and ideas into their own words and kind of develop a toolbox for themselves so that they can develop some competence and confidence before they go into practice. So the box titled "You are entering a chat session" is what the learner sees. And you can see the beginning of the conversation between the learner and the facilitator. At the end of the conversation, facilitators can provide students with immediate feedback about their performance before they move on to the next section of the case. And we've heard from students that this is really important to them because they can then incorporate the feedback into the other chat sessions in the scenario and continually be improving their performance, as opposed to carrying on, not knowing how they've done, and then try to assimilate the feedback at the end and back into kind of how they have thought about their experience. And so this real-time immediate feedback is an important aspect of this activity. The picture with the 4 white columns is an example of the Facilitator Screen. Each column represents one learner, and currently we can have up to 8 learners on a screen. And those white columns track the conversation between the learner and the facilitator. And speaking about tracking, every click, every kind of word, every answer within the Open Labyrinth platform is tracked. So we can speak more to that in our analytics section. So currently one facilitator can manage up to 5 students when we have kind of a scenario with several of these chats. We have also experimented with staggering student starts, so 20 minutes apart. And that actually helps increase the capacity for the facilitator in these scenarios as well. I'd like to share one of the new ways that we've used virtual scenarios with these real-time chat sessions. And this was developed during the rapid shift we needed to make to online learning at the beginning of COVID-19. So during May and June of 2020, clinical practice for nursing students at the University of Calgary was moved to online, and it was completely project-based. So what this meant was that there was minimal or no patient interaction. So in the addiction and mental health course, I had students create their own virtual patient scenarios with these real-time chat sessions. And so there were some real benefits to their learning. They chose a topic they were interested in, but still had to apply the concepts we were learning in class to the topic of their own interest. They developed their own learner outcomes, so they were very much in charge of kind of what they thought they wanted to learn. And so they created a patient profile, they developed these narratives, they facilitated and played their completed scenarios with their peers and frontline healthcare providers. So all of these things contributed to meaningful learning for them. They met those principles of meaningful learning in various ways. And in the feedback I received, students said that it was the next best thing to actual clinical practice. So this was in part to having to consider the role of the nurse, but also other perspectives such as that of the patient, being an educator, when they developed their scenarios. They also said that they learned additional skills from the frontline clinicians when they played their cases with them. So things like how to pace an interview, kind of that critical thinking piece about why I would inquire about one aspect of the patient experience and not the other. And students also said that when they played with their peers, they played these cases with their peers, they learned about topics that they would not have otherwise learned about in class. And so it was a way then to kind of broaden the learning that was occurring with that foundational piece that about the concepts that they learned in class and how they would apply those to different scenarios. Our instructors who coach students in this learning said that it was insightful to see the students' initial scripts as they were creating these, because it really highlighted where their learning gaps were. And for us in particular, gaps around content or concepts, that foundational piece, as well as things like prioritization skills. So just before David talks about some of the analytics that are available, I want to briefly mention the technical requirements that are necessary to develop and play these scenarios. So students use their own laptops. They require a functional internet and a web browser. Usually Chrome or Firefox is preferred. But what this means is that students can access the scenarios wherever they have technology and internet. So there's no need for dedicated space or specialized equipment for them to learn in this way. So David, I will hand it over to you for the section on analytics.
Right. So this is a part of Open Labyrinth that we have found to be very powerful. And we are not expecting early authors and early teachers to think strongly about this. It is more useful once you have your students using the cases lots and interacting with them. And it is useful in many ways. I think that Michelle just gave some very good examples of how running the cases and actually using them in practice gave very good feedback to the teachers about these gaps. The analytics, the numbers that are pulled from Open Labyrinth can show us some of the same things. So for example, when the students are working their way through a pathway, there tends to be a typical pathway, and it is useful to look at the pathways afterwards, and you can see if some students get lost. That may be because of poor student knowledge, but we also find quite often that if many students get lost in the same place, it is because of a weakness in our case design. So looking at how the cases themselves perform has been very useful. The things that are captured, Michelle mentioned already, every click, every response, every interaction is all stored in some tables in the back end. And this, the primary way is they are stored, just for those with an IT background, they are stored in a SQL or SQL table. And that makes it easy to pull this data out into whatever your favorite statistics or analytics tool is. We also have a secondary mechanism where some of the activity data, again, tracking who does what when. That is all stored in a learning record store through something called XAPI. And that allows us to pull in data from multiple different platforms, not just Open Labyrinth. Just last week, I was looking at some of the analytics from our cases, and we now have more than 25 million data points on that one server. This is a very rich data store for all cases. But I encourage your groups to look at how your cases perform, as well as how your learners perform once you have the cases up and running.
Thanks, David. Was there anything else? I don't want to cut you off.
No, I think I'm done for that. Again, if there are any questions on that, either now or in the later in the session, happy to answer those.
We actually had a student not too long ago, last winter, who actually tried to cheat. So alter the screen, alter some of the answers, make it look like she had actually attempted the activity when that was not the case. And so all of the analytics that David is talking about, we were able to pull those together and to identify that what she had actually done was alter the screen, not actually attempt the case. And so that doesn't happen very often, but those reports and that background data is available in the event that we need it in those ways as well. So I just want to briefly talk about learner outcomes. I know you are all familiar with the importance of learner outcomes, but I bring this up because they are actually the anchor point to your virtual scenarios. So they provide direction for the type of branching narrative you might use, which activities you choose to engage learners, and how you provide feedback. And they also are somewhat directive about the types of consequences that the students might experience based on the choices that they're making within your scenario. So do we want them to learn about things like personal bias, values and beliefs, and how those kind of integrate with our professional responsibilities? Because that's again, a different level than just the process of a task. Do we want them to discover how to kind of do a task in a situation that's not ideal, where we may not have the same resources that we did in a lab when we practiced? And so these learner outcomes are really important for direction for those things. So creating a scenario template, and this is what we will talk a lot about when we start doing some individual work. So these are some guiding questions that you might want to consider when you decide on the structure or the type of branching narrative you want to use, and the various options for engaging your learners. So what do you want your learners to get out of the simulation? And this helps identify the parameters of the scenario. So where will you start and end kind of in the story? And how much time will you give learners to complete the scenario? One of the things when our students created the scenarios for themselves is they actually started quite broad, and one of the very first things that they learned was they were not very familiar with all the pieces that kind of played into the process of getting from A to B. And so this is where we saw significant gaps in their knowledge about, you know, what kind of data, what other data do you need to gather to make that decision? Do you even know what the policy is to actually do that intervention? And so, or even definitions about particular things, like do you know the definition for domestic violence? So these were some of the things that we saw. So if there's too much to learn, you might end up with an 8-hour virtual simulation, which is a little lengthy. What do learners already know, and how will you activate learners' prior knowledge? And these are helpful questions to identify your assumptions about students' prior learning, and what cues they're going to need to remember that previous learning. So how will they bring that forward? And that's been important because what I've noticed in nursing is that we have this assumption that students have learned that, you know, in the course before, or maybe first year. And when they come to us, it has magically retreated into the recesses of knowledge, and it doesn't come forward automatically. And so this is an important thing to think about. How are we going to activate that and bring that forward so that it's a consideration as they make decisions? What connections do you want learners to make between this prior knowledge and the emerging knowledge? So this is helpful to determine which learning activities are best suited to the level of complexity. So for example, how might the facilitator respond in a chat session? So we actually give our facilitators a facilitator guide with some suggestions about how to stay in character. So if we have a patient who, for example, has a significant mental illness, we actually want them to respond in that way to mimic the real life clinical scenario. So the patient might swear, the patient might have short one-word answers, or they might just go on and on and on. For example, if they're manic, and the learner has to figure out kind of what information is important out of that, and kind of maybe even how to interrupt or set boundaries. And also, the closer the language is to that of the real context, the easier it is for the learner to assume the role. And what we find is that when learners actively buy into the simulation or the scenario as a real professional and assume the professional role, the higher the degree of affective learning is. So not only are they kind of thinking about the tasks and applying the knowledge, there's this component about how do I feel as a professional? Am I nervous? How does that impact my care? Or man, I'm finding this frustrating. And it gives them an opportunity when they're immersed in that to be able to actually manage some of these emotions that they will feel as novice practitioners. And then what other skills might learners need? This is important to consider how learners will acquire the additional skills that they need to move forward in the scenario. So how are these? It's important to think about how the skills are acquired in the real world, and how closely we can mimic these within the scenario. And so again, a lot of this is through language, as well as like those audiovisual add-ins. So like real diagnostic pictures, what the slide looks like, those types of additional learning opportunities. So finally, I'd like to emphasize the importance of creating a script before putting all this information into Open Labyrinth. So I find that kind of putting this script or creating this script in a Word document works best. It allows me to kind of, so some of the benefits is it allows me to kind of see the whole scenario in one go instead of screen by screen. And this is really helpful for me to kind of understand where I'm going in this and kind of how each activity is creating or contributing to the overall learner outcomes that I want to achieve. It's also much easier to make mass edits. So like a big spelling check, or if I need to move a lot of pieces around and change the order, sometimes it's easier to kind of get that down in a Word document or a script form before we start putting it into the Open Labyrinth. So all in all, it's more efficient. And then when the whole Word document is spell checked, it's a matter of cut and pasting for the most part into the map. And that's what we call how we lay out the script in Open Labyrinth, is that we create a map. So this brings us to the end of the general overview. I recognize that we've not shown you how to create these templates or the maps in Open Lab, but I thought that this might be better done with your own material so that you have a chance to navigate for yourself in Open Labyrinth and learn the tools like how to create the questions and things like this that are specific to your case. So we can take a few minutes to answer some questions you might have from that. And then we can start moving into helping you get started on your own scenarios. Yeah. Was this helpful for you to kind of understand the overall picture?
Hola. Por aquí. Me parece fantástico la herramienta que ustedes están presentando, todas las ventajas que contribuyen al aprendizaje, sobre todo en estos ambientes de práctica que son tan necesarios para preparar al estudiante antes de meter las manos, ¿cierto?, en un contexto real. Me parece muy interesante, está muy bien fundamentado y orquestado. Me gustaría en algún momento, no sé si dentro de esta presentación vamos a tener acceso a mirar dentro de la plataforma cómo funciona en su totalidad. Estupendo. Muchas gracias, muy bonito todo.
Any other questions? We're gonna, I have created kind of a mini script, and then, so I'll show you kind of what that looks like. And then we can show you an example in Open Labyrinth. David and I were looking actually for a case in Spanish, and we don't have one that's been translated into Spanish yet. So it will be in English, but you'll be able to see the visual layout of it. Other questions?
Michelle?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Can you?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I want to thank you for this training, and I have a question about the videos. How many videos can you upload it to the program, and in the format, the quality? Because in my experience area, clinic of horses, the videos are very important. So
yes.
So you said only photograph. So I want to know if, okay. Yeah. Okay. And how many videos support the program or for the case? On one case, how many videos can you upload it?
Okay. So I'm going to let David answer this question. And David, maybe you can talk about the video mashup tool as well.
Thanks, Michelle. So that is a very good question. Yes, you can upload videos directly to the server. We find that approach, it doesn't work very well. That the server quickly becomes full, and the server itself is not very good at sending video to more than one person at once. It quickly becomes bogged down. So what we do instead is we upload our videos to YouTube, and then we use, we have a mashup tool called Curios, which allows us to break up any video into segments, to have pointers to any video, so you can have start points, stop points, you can add extra annotation, extra materials, and it can be frustrating for a learner to be told, you know, here's a video, but only this piece is useful, and they have to go find that piece. Well, Curios will take them to those pieces or segments automatically. It works really well. We found this approach more useful for three reasons. First of all, YouTube, as we all know, is set up for huge files and huge bandwidth. We do not have to worry about the video server getting dragged down to being too slow. Secondly, that because of the way it can segment and create pieces of a video, that it saves a lot of post-production time. In most video projects that we have done, the time you spend after you have shot your video material, editing down to exactly what you need, that takes hours. And Curios allows us to shortcut that. You don't have to touch the original material at all. You just change your time points, you add overlays. You do not have to wait while the video is rendered, etc. It also means you can take a single video and use it in many different ways for different levels of learner, etc. So it works well. And the best bit is that it does not even have to be your video. It will work with 90% of videos on YouTube. And because you are not copying the material, you don't even have to ask for permission or copyright. We think it is polite to do that, but it is not a requirement. Not all authors respond to questions for permission. So if you can't reach them, you can use it anyway.
Okay, very clear. Thank you very much.
Thanks, David. Other questions or curiosities?
Hola. Quisiera consultar respecto a las imágenes. En cuanto a las fotos, ahí no es problema. Si uno utiliza bastantes imágenes por el peso de esto, no. Gracias.
So we have not had an issue with including a lot of pictures into our cases for nursing. So David, do you have any other thoughts about the number of pictures?
No, pictures are easy to do and are not a limitation. The only time we find that pictures create problems is if the picture itself is too big. And there are some funny little quirks to make Open Labyrinth display the picture at the size that you want. But it's easy to do in principle, and we have some teaching notes on how to do that. But you are not limited at all in how many pictures or the size of the pictures. That has not been a problem.
Great, thank you.
Tengo una pregunta.
Yes.
En lo que nos estuvo explicando, entiendo que por un lado están los escenarios que el docente fabrica, elabora, ¿cierto?, para trabajar con sus estudiantes, ¿cierto?, en cuanto a la toma de decisiones y ese tipo de trabajo. Y por otro lado están los escenarios que el estudiante elabora. ¿Eso es así? ¿Lo entendí bien? Gracias.
Yes. So we actually started with the instructors or the teachers creating the scenarios because we have some ideas about what we want them to learn. And we have some ideas about the difficulty of applying that material in scenarios that are not textbook examples. And so how do students adapt and adjust and manipulate that information they know to be able to function in clinical practice? When our clinical, for nursing, when our clinical practice went online and students did not have that interaction in the real clinical setting, that's when a I decided that maybe we should get them to create their own scenarios. And, you know, like, I think that we have evidence about, you know, how effective their learning is when they play through the scenarios. But what I wasn't entirely expecting kind of what they were telling me about how this impacted their learning when they created their own scenarios. And so just, you know, things like, well, Michelle, they would say to me, Michelle, I don't know how the patient would react in that situation. And I'm like, well, if you were in clinical practice and you didn't know something, how would you go about getting that information? And so it was like, when they had to create their own scenarios, they actually had to think on a different level about how do I, when I'm a professional, how do I get information? Because I'm not just going to go and ask my instructor anymore, right? Like, so they started thinking about these additional professional competencies when they had to create their own scenarios. And so, you know, there was something really powerful about that. All the students who have created their own scenarios, we have published their scenarios. And so there's this other professional aspect about knowledge translation, sharing your information, that was really powerful. The whole iterative, I mentioned kind of gaps in knowledge when they created their own. And a lot of this was process orientated. Like, you can't just go from point A to B with like 2 steps. If in actuality, they're like in clinical practice, I would need to be talking to other people to get other information. I'd need to be consulting policies. And these are the activities that the students, I don't think they learned in a different way when they had to create their own scenarios, because the information in the scenario needed to be factual. So they needed to go and get the information. And so those types of skills on a professional level are really valuable. And we have had some feedback that when our students then go in to do their final practicum, which is a one-on-one situation in clinical practice, that they are more comfortable with seeking out feedback. They're more comfortable with collaborating. They're more comfortable when they don't know something about, you know, what are the steps I would do to go find out. And so I think that those are really valuable professional competencies for safe practice.
Sí, suena muy motivante lo que nos cuentas, pero para la creación de estos escenarios por parte de los estudiantes, se les presentó a ellos una pauta, una guía de cómo empezar a trabajar en esto, porque, no sé, imagino que cuando estás en una situación desconocida, como por dónde comienzo, es un gran paso que muchas veces cuesta.
Yes. Well, I can say when we first initiated this, there was a very little formal information we gave them because we were doing this on the fly during COVID. However, this has evolved. So now there are rubrics for each step of the creation that we have. We have guides for students around, you know, just like we provided for you, what types of questions would you use to get at different kinds of learning or information. We also started out now with them describing how their topic connects to their clinical practice and the concepts they're using in class. So there is more structure for students about how to get started and kind of the expectations for the learning along the way. It was definitely a work in progress. Okay, I just want to be mindful of the time. So, oh, sorry, did you have another question? Okay, so I just want to be mindful of the time, and I think the first thing, please jump in with any other questions that you have as we go along. So I think the first thing I want to show you is the script. And this is just short. It's based on the story, the fairy tale that we went through in the presentation. And I'm just going to share my screen here. Do I need to make this a little bigger? or can we see this okay? Okay, so normally
Un poquito más.
a little bigger. Okay. Good. Okay, so this one was quite short. And so what we asked students to do is to kind of develop some background information. So in this case, it would be the story. So, you know, how did you get to this situation? Who's involved? What's the setting? What is the role of the professional here? You know, and to kind of flesh out some of the relationships and some of the past history. So for our scenarios, so has this person been in hospital before? Have they had these kinds of episodes before? What's their home life like? What are their finances like? What is the access to resources like? These are the things that they're going to flesh out in the background information, so that we're pretty clear on what the context is. Then we also ask students to create kind of what is the current context? So where does the story begin? So they're just coming on maybe a day shift at the hospital, and this particular patient has been assigned to them. And then kind of what the task is going forward, that they need to go introduce themselves. So for some of our novice nurses, introducing yourself is kind of a new skill. So we want them to say what their name is, what their occupation is, and what their responsibilities are to the patient. So for some that is a learning activity. So we have the background, the current context, and then we have some other types of ways that we can go about this. So sometimes this includes some questions to activate prior learning. So how we set this up is that because this is short, it's in a table. You can do this in a table, or for our longer scenarios, I've just used a Word document, and each new section of the scenario is the beginning of a new page. And just through my own learning, this is probably the most effective way to set this script up, is that each new page in the scenario is a new page in your Word document. So by the time I get to page 3, I'm now thinking about what kinds of questions do I want to ask, and to activate the knowledge they're going to have to bring forward to actually manage in this case. So this might be the questions about how are you going to take on this challenge, for example, in this fairy tale. And I need to think about, am I going to give them the answer, let them know if it's right or wrong, what kind of feedback will I give them, because we want to eliminate opportunities for the learner to get derailed early on. And so sometimes this initial feedback is really helpful to kind of get everyone in a place where they are situated to move forward in the case and deal with the presenting problem or the new knowledge. Now, when we use real-time chat scenarios, I'm just going to we actually have a template, and I will actually put the document in the chat session in a few minutes. And it's kind of like a flow sheet about, so when we have real-time chat sessions, we want to have these questions that activate learners and prepare them for this conversation. So if we're going to be doing some kind of assessment, what do they need to know about the assessment? So some of our learners created a scenario around domestic violence. And so the questions were revolved around establishing a definition, a scholarly definition for what is domestic violence. So some of our, maybe there was a select all that apply question where the student had to pick out kind of the criteria. This might also be diagnostic criteria that they need to pick out. And then we actually asked other questions about you know, what is included in an assessment for domestic violence. So by the time they got to this initial real-time chat session, with the facilitator who role played the patient, and they had to complete this assessment. They already knew what domestic violence was and the criteria. They already knew what was included in this type of assessment, and they were ready to engage in this conversation. We weren't just asking them to jump into this conversation without kind of activating that knowledge. So after the conversation, then we provide a summary. So kind of a summary of, well, at the end of the Turk Talk, let's just back up. At the end of the real-time chat session, the facilitator will give them direct feedback. So you hit all the areas of the assessment you needed to, or these are the areas you missed. You asked good open-ended questions, or you forgot to ask about harm. So they give them immediate feedback. And then the next step would be to give a summary of kind of where their learner should be at the end of that conversation. So the summary might include what the most important points from the conversation that the student should have come up with. So if they've missed something, we're filling in the gaps so that they then can continue with the case. They can use that information to move forward. And so then we usually have two real-time chat sessions, for example, in a case, just in terms of the amount of time this takes. And so the questions in between the first and second real-time chat sessions would then be building new knowledge. So these might be things like, so you have confirmed that domestic violence is occurring. What are your next steps? This might not be something that learners know. So we would actually, that could be a really good multiple choice question or an ordering question where they would need to kind of critically think about what they would do next to demonstrate their learning, but have opportunities for feedback and to try the question again. So we would structure that type of learning leading up to the next conversation, which might be actually making the phone call to report this domestic violence. So the question might be, who do you report this to? And they would need to decide that. So by the time they get to the second real-time chat where they are actually engaging in reporting the domestic violence, they are aware of what they need to report, who they are talking to. And then the facilitator in that scenario is no longer the patient. The facilitator would change role and actually be the person in the government agency that they would be reporting to. So at the end of most of our scenarios, we have questions such as, because some of these are really difficult conversations to have. And so we would have reflective questions about, you know, what did you know, how did you notice you were feeling as you were thinking that domestic violence was happening to this child? Because these are difficult things. We don't engage in these types of care activities without kind of having some type of emotional reaction usually. And often in clinical practice, we can't show our feelings. We need to remain somewhat neutral and non-judgmental. And so this gives them an opportunity to intentionally identify what is going on for them and to reflect on how what they were feeling actually impacted their performance. So this tends to be a really important part of their learning in terms of, yeah, I was feeling like that. How would I mitigate that when I'm talking to the patient or to the client, or a colleague, so that I can maintain my professional role? How do I manage that when I go home? And I'm ruminating about my performance at work. How do I manage that? And so these are things that are often kind of missed on an intentional level in our curriculums. And then at the end, we always provide kind of an update. So what did happen to the patient? Are they okay? Because leaving it hanging is somewhat anxiety producing for learners when they don't know how this might have ended. This may have ended with a patient dying, or this may have ended with an argument with a colleague or whatever, but that piece of closure about how did this potentially end is an important way for for learners to be able to move forward to and not get stuck in, here's the scenario. So in terms of the document that you see, each one of those activities would be on a new page. So for example, if, let's say on this one here, before you give the king the answer, you consider the risks of the mission, and you need to decide what to tell the king. If the learner decides that, you know, I am not going to rescue his daughter because I don't want to die personally, my life is more valuable than that, we can send the learner to a different page. So we can talk about, you know, what does that mean? What would this mean for the relationship with the king? What does this mean for kind of your ability to gain further work, your financial status? So we can actually, when they make these decisions that aren't ideal, we can send them to different pages so that they can begin reflecting on the impact of these choices. And once we've done that, then we can give them the option to come back to this page to make a different choice and play through the case differently. So it is one way that learners become more aware of the implications of their choices and behavior. So the value of doing this in a Word document is, if that's the case, if I were to choose B, right in this Word document, I could say, go to page, I don't know, 12, if that's the page, and that's where the other part of this scenario will play out. When that's done, at the end of that page, I would say return to page 2. And so it's often helpful to kind of have the larger layout all in front of you instead of just playing through the case page by page. Is that explanation helpful with the script?
Sí.
Okay. Yes. So I think the next thing is, David, would you be willing to play through the Cheryl case and be the patient?
I can do that.
Okay, so we're just going to take a minute to log into Open Labyrinth, and then we can show you what the case actually looks like.
Michelle, ¿puedo hacer una pregunta?
Absolutely. Sure.
En cuanto al tiempo de preparación de un caso, ¿cuánto tiempo toman en la preparación y tiempo en la implementación con el curso?
Yes. So this is somewhat of a difficult question, because when you do your first case, it obviously takes longer as you're learning to navigate around Open Labyrinth and kind of structure your thoughts into an unfolding case. And it's also dependent upon the complexity of your case. So obviously, the more complex it is, the longer it will take. So when I first started doing this for one of the initial cases that we had, the simulation time ran about an hour and a half to 2 hours. So that's about how long it would take. This included 2 real-time chat sessions. And initially that took me probably 2 weeks to develop that case, get it in Open Labyrinth, and to test it. So as a rough idea. Now, I mean, I've written a lot of cases. So now it takes me a lot less time. So I would just say be patient. And it's difficult to kind of create a case that you want to implement in the next month. So to give yourself maybe some time to do this before your term starts is probably a lot less stressful way to approach this.
And we find that many authors are too ambitious. They try to create too big a case to start with. Keep it nice and simple, because you can always go back to a case and extend and build upon it later, but keep your first attempts really simple, 3 or 4 steps at most, because it's surprising what you can achieve with that, and then you can build later.
Michelle, David, una pregunta técnica. Para que funcione la plataforma Open Labyrinth, nosotros tenemos que instalar el código fuente en algún servidor, porque entiendo que solo podemos subir demos a la página inscribiéndonos en la página de Open Labyrinth. Mi pregunta es, ¿qué capacidad promedio o estimada tiene ese espacio que nos dan para poder subir un demo, que podría ser un buen ensayo en base al consejo que ustedes nos dan?
The web server can be really quite simple. It is not technically sophisticated. It does not need much space. I can send you the technical requirements for what is needed. We usually use Linux web servers because that is the commonest around the world, but it can be done with pretty much anything which will provide web pages. In the meantime, for your authors, you are very welcome to use our demo server, because the cases that are created on there are then easy to export from ours and import onto your server. So yes, we should talk about it, but there is no urgency, or we do not have to rush to get a server running for your authors. They are welcome to use ours in the meantime.
Ok, muchas gracias.
So David, I'm just going to go to the N589 case. So when you open it, you'll go to the N589 case.
Okay, I'll do that. I was in the other demonstrators.
Yeah, thank you.
Second here. Scenarios, my scenarios, N589.
Okay, so do you even have that one? Sorry. Okay.
Yes, I do. N589 MHC.
You have that one?
Or we can use T-Talk
That's
simple
fine.
demonstrator scenario. That works.
Okay.
Because it's got Cheryl in there too.
Okay. Can you remind N-Talk, what was that? Sorry.
T-Talk simple demonstrator scenario.
Okay, there we go. Good. All right.
All right, I'm in.
Okay. So is it possible that David and I can both share our screens? I'm not sure if David has access to screen sharing is what I'm asking.
I can screen share, but it needs to be one person at a time.
Yeah. Okay. And who did you log in as, David?
Me.
Okay, great. Okay. So I will, do you want to share what your screen looks like first? And can you make it a little bit bigger? Thank you. So when students log in, this is kind of what they will see something like this. So it will be a scenario. We can include several different cases within one scenario. So in our addictions and mental health course, we have 3 or 4 scenarios that the students work through. So we include them all together here. And we can turn them on and off as we need to. So you'll see that the Turk Talk demo case or the T-Talk demo case is off, but the Cheryl version 4, so it has a green play button beside it. And so that lets the students know that that's open and they can access this case. So I am sorry that it's in English, but we need to get on that. So this would be a general introduction to the case about kind of what they're going to be doing today. If there are real-time chat sessions, it will be explained here. And then they will go on to the client profile. So this would be the background information that I spoke about. So kind of maybe a health history, previous admissions, accessing previous healthcare, things like that. And then they would go on to the case study. And this explains the current context. So the beginning of your shift, you're going out to see a client at this particular time. You have to review lab results, whatever it might be. Okay. So in this particular example, this patient here, her name is Cheryl, and she's a school teacher, and she's been smoking marijuana in her car in the student parking lot over the lunch hour. And so she has kind of been found out. And so the student is eventually going to need to talk as a nurse in a community clinic with this patient to set return to work goals. So this first question is really asking, this would be an example of select all that apply. And this is really kind of asking the learner to think about what would contribute to this patient's marijuana smoking or smoking marijuana. What would contribute to that behavior? And so David, do you want to maybe just click on one of them? And this might be one option, decreased coping skills. So this is an example of a dandelion, so a multiple choice where there's further explanation needed. So it comes up, yes, this is a contributing factor, and it provides some information about why this is a contributing factor and some context for this particular patient. So then the student can go on and choose a variety of other options that are listed. So maybe high stress, and this would come up as no, this is incorrect. And it would give the rationale for why, and again, some context for the learner about why this would not be correct in this particular case. You also, and then there's an option here, if they don't want to click anymore, they can just, I mean, it's up to them. They can actually just go on in the case. So they might click the done with contributing factors button, and it would bring them up to the next thing. For this interview, it's important that the students were able to follow kind of a process for a motivational interview. And so this question here is asking students to identify kind of the aspects of motivational interviewing so that they are understanding how the theory is brought into this clinical situation. So David, do you want to click one of these? And again, they can choose and find out yes or no, et cetera, et cetera. So they can be done with this. I just want to move forward to this is an example of a multiple choice. And this is really asking about what they would do first. So there's one right answer. So if you want to click on one, David. So this would tell them the red X, this is the wrong answer, and there's a brief explanation here. So this would be kind of one of those, it's a different kind of question for multiple choice where we can provide some brief feedback. Okay, so now we can be done and move on. And this is actually the first real-time chat session. So here the student is supposed to, introduce themselves, and they're supposed to ask Cheryl, the format for motivational interviewing is to ask the client, what is really good about smoking marijuana? We want to inquire about what is really good about this habit that they have. So David would type in hello to start the conversation, right? Now, I, as a facilitator, am role playing Cheryl. I'm going to pretend I'm the patient here. So this patient doesn't want to be in this interview. They think this is a waste of time, not really too interested in changing my smoking habits. So I would respond then is, hi, I don't really want to be here. and how long is this really going to take? So to really be able to stay in the role of the patient makes this more real for the learners. And so as you can see on David's screen, there is this running conversation that's occurring. And because David's a very good clinician, he says, we can be here as long as you want or have time for. Very compassionate. So I will just share my screen now, and I'll show you what is happening for the facilitator. So this is what the facilitator screen looks like. And so this pink column right here, the first column, is the conversation between David and I. These other columns are other students that I may have who are doing the case at the same time. So I can keep a running list, or I can be aware of all these kind of conversations that are happening. And because one of the questions we get is it difficult to keep track of all these conversations? So because they are all focused around one type of conversation or getting at one thing in this particular conversation, it is not that hard because they are all doing versions of similar things. So just to orientate you to the screen, when the conversation gets too long, these scroll bars appear so that we can go back and look at conversations. These phrases in the I don't understand, or it's pink and green and red, sometimes after we've played a case a whole bunch of times, this is where David was talking about some of those analytics, identifying kind of common places that students go first, we can actually create quick response buttons. So if we know that most of our students will say, I don't know, how are you feeling today? We can actually create a quick response to that. I feel great. So I would click on this text box here, then I would click on my quick response, and I can hit submit. And so this actually helps to speed up some of these conversations as well. Okay, and then down here, the one that is now kind of has the blue around it, this is where the facilitator types in their responses. Okay. Any questions about what this looks like? David says, thank you for being patient with me. It's really demonstrating some good professional competencies about compassion and empathy here.
Michelle, este proceso es en tiempo real. O sea, el facilitador o el docente está conectado al mismo tiempo de los estudiantes que están revisando el caso.
Yes. We have done this with facilitators who aren't in our same location. So they have been in the United States, they've been in Europe. And so we just coordinate our time zones, and it doesn't really matter where your facilitators are. So that's another bonus to this, is that they get exposure to different types of cultural responses even. Now, if there is no facilitator available for when we have real-time chats like this, students can still play through the case. There is an option on those screens where David was typing in to bypass the real-time chats. So this is helpful in the sense that the students can still go through the case and be making those decisions and learning from those questions or other learning activities. But when they come back to play this case again, it will still be different because they may have a different facilitator every time who responds slightly different based on their own clinical experience, the way that they word things themselves. And so it's like getting a new patient every single time you open this case. Now, not all cases have the real-time chat. This is just one example. Like I said, some of our cases, they make decisions and then they can go down this alternative pathway where, perhaps harm comes to the patient or the pet, or there's an argument that ensues because of how you communicated with your colleague, that you can make other choices through that pathway. to try to resolve the conflict or fix what you made a mistake, or maybe it's a dire outcome, such as the patient passes away. And then we can reflect on that, but there's an opportunity then to go back and make a different choice and play through the case differently. We have not had a problem getting facilitators. Our students who have done these cases as part of their coursework end up emailing me like every term, actually. Hey, are you doing any more virtual sims, and can I help facilitate? Like they're actually emailing me wanting to facilitate. And it's interesting because I'm curious about what makes them keep coming back without me pursuing them. And part of this is they actually like to be on the other side now of the learner. They like to contribute what they've learned in their clinical practice, but there's also a benefit to them. Some of the feedback I've gotten is, being a facilitator really makes me think about my own clinical practice differently. I can, I start to think about how I ask questions differently, or how I make decisions and other factors that might be involved. So it is like almost a refresher for the facilitator as well. We've also had senior students facilitate junior students doing this, and the learning for our senior students is just as good as the junior students. It's different. It's more about higher level critical thinking and decision making than for our junior students, but the learning is significant.
Sí, perdón, tienes razón, porque nos permite medir, verificar otras competencias en los alumnos de cursos más avanzados. Ya, no solamente el cuánto conocen, sino cómo se enfrentan, por ejemplo, con un paciente o con un dueño de una mascota. Y eso lo puede ir evaluando también hacia sus compañeros de cursos más, ¿cómo se llama?, más inferiores.
Yes, that's a great point.
Súper
One of the
bueno.
other things I've done
Okay,
in
muchas
particular
gracias.
with this motivational interviewing case is they've actually printed off their transcripts, because at the end of every scenario, they can save their work as a transcript. So every answer they provide to a question, every real-time chat session, every short answer, whatever they've done in the case is recorded, and they can save that as a transcript. So I have my students save their transcript, and then they have to go back through the transcript and identify how they aligned with the therapeutic model of motivational interviewing, and where they didn't and where they did, and what the impact for the patient was of that. And so I've actually had students email me or come back and facilitate, and they say, Michelle, this was the best case I've ever done, because I had to do that reflective activity. And it is one of the things I have remembered most about my entire nursing education. So I think, that's interesting to hear as a teacher as well. Okay, so I think maybe it would be helpful if you can keep asking questions if you'd like. I think what might be helpful is to kind of hear about your ideas for your own projects and where you're starting, and kind of questions you have about your own projects that we can help you move forward. I have created like login usernames and passwords for each of you into Open Labyrinth. And so we can do that as well. I'm wondering what would be most beneficial for the time that we have left.
Michelle, quisiera hacer una pregunta antes de ver los casos respecto a cómo se evalúa esto, porque lo encuentro súper interesante y creo que tiene una parte formativa bien extensa, que es durante todo el desarrollo y que van haciendo los estudiantes. Pero finalmente, si uno quiere hacer, obtener una nota como evaluación sumativa, que quede como final, ¿en qué punto recomiendas que se haga de todo el proceso?
That's a great question. That's a great question. And I have done this multiple ways. So when students answer the questions, you can assign marks to that. So 1 mark for correct answer. For our select all that apply answers, I actually do a plus or minus system. So I take away marks if you just like for the ones that you check that shouldn't be checked, because it deters students from just selecting all the answers, right? So, but you can assign grades to each question or marks to each question. And at the end, it can tally these marks. And for us, we can actually export that to a spreadsheet, which then we can upload to our learning management system or our grade books. So that is one way if we're into like that kind of evaluation around the question part of it. The other way has been this reflective assignment where they take their transcripts and then I actually grade the paper. This is actually, I find that this has been really meaningful learning for the students because they get a little uptight about how well they're going to perform in the simulation. They got to do everything right? And then they get stuck in this, I got to reply like the textbook mode, as opposed to thinking about how else am I going to do that when the scenario isn't like the textbook. So that reflective assignment is helpful. The other way that I have done this is in one of our nursing courses, they need to practice handing off information to another professional. And so they work through the case and the case ends at a point where they actually need to talk to this professional. And then we actually give them a template. We call it the SBAR. I don't know if you guys use SBAR, but it's situation, background, assessment, recommendations. And they fill out the template and submit that. And so when they submit that, that gets graded. And there is an accompanying instructor template for that about key points they need to include so that the marking isn't super onerous, because in large classes, we don't want to be marking like 300 papers. So those are some of the ways that we have managed evaluation. David, did you have other ways from your experience?
I think you've touched on the formal ways. The other ways in which we have used our cases, and it works better for senior learners, and it works particularly well for practitioners who are doing continuing professional development. So they're upgrading their skills, is to create cases where there is not a perfect answer, that you have a set of choices. None of the choices are, all of the choices are possibly correct, but some are better than others. And to use this case along with small group discussions so that when there is a difference of opinion as to how the case should have been handled, this gets some debate and discussion going. We find that kind of technique very popular with more senior learners, because then they can put forward a case and an argument as to why one way is better than another.
And that kind of activity can be used with like discussion boards and things like that.
Yep.
Gracias.
I think that I will show you where you at? I think that I want to show you kind of what a map looks like in Open Labyrinth. I think this might be a bit helpful. And then this might help also to identify why I think it's helpful to write the script in a Word document first, each section having its own page. So, whoops. So this is an example of the map for the case that David and I were just playing through. So this is the introduction. So each of these boxes is, we call them nodes. And in essence, they represent a page in your Word document. So once you have that Word document down, or the script, then we can just cut and paste that for the most part into these different nodes or boxes. And then we can attach them with arrows. So this is what you're seeing right now is an example of the dandelion that I talked about. So where we have a select all that apply that has those kind of expanded rationales or explanations, this is kind of what we would create. So if I have 5 options, I would go into one of these and I might choose the dandelion, and then I can choose the number of options, or I can choose the custom button and choose 3 options or whatever it might be. And it will create this kind of matrix. So you're not actually adding all these arrows all by yourself, because that is kind of a nightmare. So it will create this matrix for you, and then you can go and here's your original question, and then here's your first answer with the rationale, your second answer with the rationale, and then you can edit it easily here as well. So this is one of the reasons why I'm suggesting that it's in a Word document, because trying to create it on the fly as you're creating these nodes or these boxes is time consuming. It's difficult to do like large edits on the whole document. And it can be a bit frustrating, particularly in the beginning as you create your case.
¿Es posible que nos muestren, por ejemplo, el cómo comenzar o cómo editar una primera parte, el proponer el caso, la primera situación, luego cómo se avanza en agregar, no sé, las preguntas o otra parte de texto? ¿Es posible? Se lo agradecería.
Yes. Okay, so just to clarify, do you want me to go back to the map I was showing you and show you how to start a map, or do you want suggestions for how to actually start the script?
No, el mapa me queda claro que automáticamente se genera una vez que ya se ha ingresado todos los datos de todas las hojas Word, ¿cierto? Que se traspasaron. Pero en la plataforma al inicio, como por ejemplo yo, tengo acceso a la herramienta, pero ¿cómo empiezo? ¿Por dónde escribo, por ejemplo? ¿Cómo lo hago?
¿Cómo ingresar?
Primero, lo más básico.
Claro. Perdón, Michelle. ¿Cómo ingresar un caso en la página demo, por ejemplo?
Okay, so when I actually start creating a case, I'm not sure I'm exactly clear on the question, but when I start creating a case, I actually kind of have a rough scenario in mind, and I will kind of start writing a bit of the background information. And once I kind of have the idea about the scenario and what I want the learners to do, the very first thing I do is write out those learner outcomes. And the reason why I do that is because those learner outcomes will influence where the case starts. So moving from the background information that I've written into what is the current context. Those learner outcomes also influence, do you want to have real-time chat sessions? Is that part of what you want your learner to learn, is how to communicate with a client? So maybe this is the farmer, maybe this is a colleague. Maybe I want my case to be around conflict management. And so it's going to be with a colleague. Maybe I want my case to be around looking at lab results. This could, or interpreting slides in the lab and what that means for the trajectory of an illness. And so in that scenario, I probably wouldn't have real-time chat sessions, but my learner outcomes then would need to be around things like, do I know what this slide is even of? Do I know how to work the equipment so that I can actually see this slide? Or what equipment I will need to actually interpret this lab data? And so I usually, it's an iterative process, right? Like it's not just starting and I write the background, then I write the current context, then I have my questions, and it doesn't necessarily progress linearly like that. It's very iterative. But I usually always start with an idea of what the scenario is and develop my learner outcomes. And then I decide at what point do I want this story to start? Is it in the lab? Is it, and what do my students need to know? So that influences the current context and the initial kinds of activities, questions that you're going to ask to start priming what knowledge students need to bring forward. Is that helpful? And did I understand the question properly?
Well,
Sí, me queda claro el proceso o el procedimiento que se debe comenzar a elaborar previo a lo que a usar la herramienta. Pero nos gustaría, o al menos a mí, ver el uso de la herramienta en la misma página web para más o menos familiarizarme en el contexto de la herramienta.
Okay.
do you want me to share my screen? I've got that loaded.
Sure. Sure. Thank you.
So when you log into Open Labyrinth, sorry, am I audible? Hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Sorry, flip screens back again. The master editing screen looks like this, so it'll have like a tip of the day in the middle, any cases that have been worked on recently or played recently are showed here. To come to that question of, well, how do you start a case? It's there are two simple ways. So go to the Labyrinths menu, and you can either create one using, there is a step-by-step wizard, or you can just start one manually. And for just now, I'm going to cheat and just start one manually. There are some simple things you need to put in to start with. So case titles. So case example for Chile workshop. Terrible spelling. A description. This is what this is about. If you want, doesn't matter what you put in there. The things about timing do not matter at this point. Security is who can see the case, and we recommend that until you've got your case ready for production, you keep it just to yourself and make it private, and then click on the Create Labyrinth button there. And that's sort of like your starting metadata. That is all you need to start with. What we find most useful for authors after that is then go to the visual editor, which is that simple concept mapping tool that that Michelle talked about to start with. And there is your starting or root node. To edit that node, just click on it once and it brings up a little editing panel. So you might change the title to something like start. You can type to start with, or you can copy and paste from the script you've already created. So You are off to see the dragon. Generally, it's a good idea to save each change as you go, but not crucial. To add another page, and I apologize as these symbols look so much the same. This is like a target, this is a plus button, they both look very similar. That's silly design. Anyway, to add a new page, click on the lower plus here, adds a page and adds a link between them. To edit the second page, second, save changes, and you can just continue adding pages in that way, or you can add a page off the top one.
So what David just did is when we have like choices in how you want to proceed from the start.
And you now have, you'll notice that you have two different pathways you can go along. If you wanted to bring them back together again, to add a new path, just the link or the pathway without a new node, you would use on the top target here, and you just drag the target onto where you want it to connect to. So the arrows, the links determine where people can go in the case, and clicking on the node is how you add the content. So in principle, it's very simple. And then as Michelle mentioned earlier, you can start to change things like direction, etc. So for instance, if you had made that the end, but you still want the learner to be able to go back and look at some of the information from earlier, you can give them a two-way arrow. So when they go down here and then down here, they can go back to this page, but they can't go back to that page. And you just draw your map as you go. Does that sort of make sense? It's a very flexible tool. And it does not take long for people to figure out how to use it. Mm-hmm. The only other thing I would point out here is that you can move each node around. You can move it on the page, etc. Where it is placed, the visual position does not matter at all for case play. It's only the links, the arrows, which matter. But the fact that you can move things around becomes very useful for more complicated maps. You can group nodes which have the same section or context or meaning. You can group them together. The visual layout is quite helpful to the author for reminding them of how they want the case to flow, but it doesn't change case play. That makes sense, Oscar? Okay.
Sí, fantástico.
We have lots of little videos on YouTube which do a very nice job of spelling this out in better detail, more clear to follow.
The clustering of some of these boxes has been really helpful for us. When we, for example, have sections in our cases that might have a mini quiz, for example, we can have 10 of these boxes with different questions, but we can alter what questions the students will ask depending upon who's playing this. So this gives us some variety in questions, so students aren't expecting the same questions all the time as well, which is helpful for maintaining kind of a bank of questions as well.
It
Thank
is
you, David, for
quite
explaining.
a flexible tool. For instance, sometimes we will find that in more complicated cases that you've added an area and you're not quite sure whether you're going to want it or not. So for instance, say there was a lot of information in this node here and you didn't want to lose it, but you didn't want the learners to play with it just now. Well, then you just take it out of the pathway. Just delete that link. And that way, as far as the student is concerned, they never see that page because there's nothing which leads to it. But you can still leave it there for yourself to add later or come back to or fix. So it is very good for being able to assemble and build pieces of your case without having to worry that all of it is correct.
Very wet, soggy, really deep here. It's not very pleasant. So, yeah. Yeah. Seems that way across the country. There was a little call earlier today with some folks from DC, and it sounds like they're getting some really nasty weather happening in Vancouver area.
Are there other questions?
I have a quick question for Paula. We're seeing some people who are wanting to be admitted to the room. Would these be people who are coming early for the next session? Should we let them in, or what would be your suggestion?
No, yo las admitiría más tarde. Porque la próxima sesión es a la 1:30. Por lo menos los inscritos son 3. Luis Balboa. Me voy a buscar la lista. Sí. Sí. Son Karen, Pablo y Luis. Ellos deberían llegar a la 1:30. Y creo que sería bueno que hicieran una pausa para descansar en esta media hora.
Coffee time. Did you see the size of that coffee mug that Michelle had? Oh my goodness.
It is only half full.
There. Okay, thank you everyone. You have some great questions there, and I will see if I can find some of the veterinary cases that have been done already so that you can take a look at these too.
Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, David.
Muchas gracias a ustedes.
Muchas gracias a ambos.
Gracias, Michelle.
Saludos.
Bye.
Saludos.
Thank you.
Gracias.
La idea de sesión del taller, les damos la bienvenida a esta segunda sesión del taller a Luis Balboa, Pablo Nelson y Karen, que están por ahí. No sé, Karen la vi conectada, pero sí, ahí está,
Sí.
Karen Balboa, Luis Balboa y Pablo Nelson son de la Facultad de Ciencias. Y ellos quieren ver la posibilidad de conocer Open Labyrinth y explorar en qué les puede servir en su trabajo diario o en su trabajo con los estudiantes en la utilización de esta plataforma. Son menos que en la mañana y les cuento Luis, Karen y Pablo que ya trabajaron desde las 11 hasta las 1:15 casi con profesores de la Facultad de Veterinaria en el marco de un proyecto de un concurso de innovación educativa, que también puede ser una buena idea para ustedes presentar un proyecto de innovación educativa próximamente con el CIED. Bueno, ahí Luis también les puede dar más información al respecto. Y los dejo con un honor para mí presentarles a Michelle y a David, que de la Universidad de Calgary, que son quienes han estado generosamente entregándonos su conocimiento durante esta mañana. Y Pamela y... espérenme, Pamela y Luis también están ayudándonos en la interpretación. Ellos nos solicitan que, de ser posible, enciendan solo el micrófono cuando vayan a hablar, que lo mantengan apagado. Ojalá que usen, si tienen un buen audio. Y esas son las recomendaciones. Y yo pienso que ya todos activaron su interpretación en español. Sí, los dejo con Michelle y David. Muchas gracias.
Paola, solo preguntar si tengo que grabar o tenemos que grabar porque no tengo permiso local. Ah, ya.
No,
Okay.
está grabando Rodrigo. Es que
Okay,
Luis
super.
me ha ayudado otras veces a hacer esto. Muchas gracias.
Ya vale.
Okay, well, welcome. And we're certainly glad to be here and to share our experience with Open Labyrinth, and hopefully you'll find this useful as you proceed to develop your own scenarios. I'm just going to share the screen here. And there we go. Okay, so the presentation that we're going to do for you right now is a collaboration of the development and learning of myself, Dr. David Tropps, and Dr. Rachel Ellaway. Aspects of this presentation were also presented last year at a workshop we did, so we hope that you find this helpful. So as we are currently in Calgary, I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional land territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in Southern Alberta, and the city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. So both David and I, we work for the University of Calgary. I'm a nursing instructor in the Faculty of Nursing, and I'm also receiving consulting fees for this presentation. David is a professor of family medicine in the Cummings School of Medicine, and there is no conflict of interest to declare there. So I thought that maybe we could start with some introductions, and then we can continue to go over the short presentation we have and answer some of the questions and show you a little bit about the Open Labyrinth platform. So there's 3 of you that we haven't met yet. So if you could just maybe tell us your name and kind of your area of expertise, I think that might be helpful.
Hola, buenas tardes. Karen Balboa, soy bióloga y trabajo en el área de docencia en la asignatura de biología celular. La asignatura de biología celular es una asignatura de primer año para estudiantes del área de salud, también medicina veterinaria. Eso, y un gusto poder participar.
Nice to meet you.
Estás muteado.
Ahí sí. Bueno, les decía que también para mí es un gusto estar en esta actividad. Mi nombre es Pablo Nelson, soy bioquímico y coordino el área de justamente bioquímica para carreras del área de la salud como enfermería, kinesiología y nutrición y dietética.
Ok. Hola, gusto. Muchas gracias, Michelle, y a David también por acoger este llamado, en realidad, de reiterada angustia que hemos tenido para poder aprender un poco el uso de la plataforma. Yo también soy biólogo, trabajo en el departamento de la Facultad de Ciencias, en Puerto Montt, al sur de Chile, y también he hecho docencia en el área de biología, ciencias ambientales, eso, y algunas otras cosas, pero eso principalmente. Sí, muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. So my area of expertise is in nursing and specifically addictions and mental health. So some of the examples that we share will be relevant to that, but hopefully we'll be able to articulate as well about how this may be useful for you. Okay. So as with learning, or terms in academia, there's many specific meanings for some of the terms we use. So specifically with kind of meaningful learning, ASA will use this term meaningful learning to refer to the learning process and outcomes when prior knowledge is related to and incorporated into learners' cognitive structures. And Novak later took this up and stated that meaningful learning underlines the constructive integration of thinking, feeling, and acting, leading to empowerment for commitment and responsibility. And so for the purposes of this presentation, we want to consider how can teachers design virtual scenarios to cultivate the integration of cognitive, affective, and behavioral learning to creatively solve real-world problems. So a few of the principles for meaningful learning are that it's active. Learners must cognitively engage with the material, so it must be relevant and interesting to what they will be doing. It's constructive, so students apply what they already know to new contexts, and in doing so, develop new knowledge. So an example of this for nursing is our students learn how to do sterile techniques. But as we know, sometimes this doesn't work out the same way in clinical practice that it does in the textbook. And so they may end up contaminating their field, and they need to figure out how to complete this procedure. They may either need to get new gloves, they might need to ask for help in ways that kind of conserve resources. So we don't want them to necessarily reset up their whole sterile field if it's not necessary. So in this way, it's constructive, but it's also cumulative. They need to have some information about what sterile field is. So they are building on that information that they already know. It's not rote learning that's stored independently. And it's also self-regulated. So meaningful learning is an independent process. People process information and get new, form that new learning independently. However, this doesn't mean that learning occurs in isolation. So rather, the process of constructing learning occurs differently for each person. The impact of the consequences, what they bring for past experiences, and the connections they make are all unique to them. And it's also goal-orientated. So of course, we have expected outcomes. So what are virtual patients? Well, they're an interactive computer simulation of real-life clinical scenarios for the purpose of healthcare and medical training, education, or assessment. So while this definition is specific to the virtual patients and medical and healthcare training, we acknowledge that our virtual scenarios do not include just patients, and they're not just about healthcare and medical training. So patients can include pets. So our interactions in these virtual scenarios may also include interactions between team members or experiences around how to use equipment, interpret lab and diagnostic information. And they can also be related to developing knowledge in terms of processes. So how would I complete a task, or how would I order my actions to move forward with providing, for example, patient care? So Open Labyrinth, or OLAB, is a platform that we use to create meaningful learning opportunities for learners. Well, many of the virtual scenario products that we have provide the same opportunities that are listed on this slide. OLAB is unique. It provides learners with opportunities to make decisions and experience the consequences of those decisions in a safe environment. So for example, when learners can experience the trajectory and consequences of their choices, they're cognitively engaged in constructing knowledge that is connected to their very behaviors. In addition, in our experience, when learning is mediated by a screen, so in this virtual scenario, they have time to reflect on their own emotions. And then they get to consider how these connect to personal and professional values, beliefs, and biases. And from this, they further reflect on how these values, beliefs, and biases actually impact their practice and the resulting outcomes. The branching narrative construction means that students can also play the same case several times, and they can continue to develop new knowledge because they will be making potentially different choices or different interactions each time that they play the case. So for the rest of the presentation, I'd like to talk about some design options for unfolding narratives and a few other options that we've used to successfully engage learners. So first, we're going to talk about unfolding narratives, and the examples I'm going to show you are just a few of the options. However you design the structure of the unfolding narrative is specific to the needs of your environment or what the learners need to learn. So in this first example, learners start from the same point. Then they can make different choices, but they meet at common points throughout the case. So this is a more linear case design, and it's useful if you want learners to have some choice. The consequences aren't dire, and there's a broader common outcome that you want learners to achieve. In this design, learners may start with a basic case, but can be directed to other cases depending upon their performance. So this type of branching narrative allows for more individualized and scaffolded learning. So this is helpful when we have diverse learners all in the same class, but we want to be able to challenge them as they develop more knowledge. Next, sometimes we want a cluster of cases about a certain topic. Some of the advantages of using this approach is that learners can explore various complexities about a topic in a non-specific order. And as learners play through the scenarios in different orders, they explore the topic from different perspectives. So in this situation, students may play through one of these cases and make certain assumptions about the topic. However, when they go to play another case, some of those assumptions they've made may be challenged because they're seeing the topic from a different perspective. So this is a way that we can build the natural complexity of our professional environments into student learning. In this example, the virtual scenario connects to external learning activities. So a couple ways that we've done this is that orange triangle can represent a pencil and paper assignment that students might have to do, and that would prepare them then to complete the virtual patient scenario. And we may end off with that purple shape being a standardized patient simulation. And so we're actually using these methods to build their learning and to optimize the use of our resources. Another way that this has been done is for learners to start and end with a high fidelity simulation. So basically they would start the orange triangle as a high fidelity simulation, and however that case ends is how the virtual simulation would begin. And then depending upon their performance in the virtual simulation, if they perform really well, they might go into this final high fidelity simulation where their patient is fairly stable or the situation is stable. If they don't perform as well, potentially in this virtual scenario, they may start this final simulation in a more difficult position. So those are some ways that we use that. Next, I'd like to explore some other options for engaging learners in virtual scenarios, such as the different types of questions, audiovisual add-ins, and real-time chat sessions. So to provide some context for some of the different types of questions that we're going to talk about, I'm starting with this story. It's a simple fairy tale. It's familiar to all of us. And then we can jump into the more complex topics when we talk about the scenarios you're making. So I'll give you a minute just to read this story. So basically we have a king whose princess daughter is missing and a prince who has been commissioned by the king to find her. So this first question is an example of a single multiple choice. So the benefits of single multiple choices is that there is a right and a wrong answer, as evidenced by the green check mark and the red X. So in Open Labyrinth, we call these a pick choice. So we can actually give learners feedback right away. We can show them what the right answer is or the wrong answer right away, or we don't have to. It's an option. We can also provide some short feedback about why it might be the right answer. So for example, selection A is you will risk death to save his daughter. And for now, this is the correct answer because this is obviously the honorable thing to do. So these questions are great because they're short, they're directive. We can show answers, we can provide feedback. So this would be an example of a select all that apply question. So we would call this a different type of multiple choice question. So again, we have the option to reveal answers and provide feedback. These kinds of questions are really good when there is more than one component to an answer, or where there's a complexity in factors that kind of build on each other, or to illustrate how we might need to think about different factors that relate to a particular situation. So when we do it this way, we have the option for short feedback. Sometimes our answers provide or require kind of longer explanations or rationales. And so we would use what we call a dandelion, and we'll show you what this looks like later, but just know that that option for this style of question allows you to provide longer explanations and rationales, to contextualize the answer to the particular situation, to provide information about how concepts are connected, and we can even include opportunities and resources for remedial learning. So this is an example of a matching question. So we would call this, oh, sorry, did we have a question? Okay, no problem. So we would consider this a drag and drop question where we need to kind of drag one side to the other side to match them up. So we actually create matching questions with something we call widgets, which is just another function within Open Labyrinth. These types of questions are really good for things like definitions, where we need to kind of match attributes of something, or even identify expected outcomes. With these types of questions, we can give learners multiple attempts. So if they get it, they'll know that some of them are wrong, and we can give them another attempt. And they can take as many attempts as they need to get it right. We can also include a button which allows them to click on the button and see what the correct answers are. So this is helpful if we want to have for formative learning throughout the case, to keep the learner on track to be able to meet the learner outcomes. So this is an example of an ordering or prioritization question. So where we need to decide what we would do first. And the beauty about these is that it's not just about picking the best answer. So the order of the second, third, and fourth choices is just as important as the first choice. So we know that when we do procedures, we can get the first step right, but it still matters that we get the rest of the steps correct in the right order, or it will significantly impact our outcome. So I didn't include any answers here because that may be controversial about what we would do first. So we also have audiovisual add-ins. And so these can include videos, voice recording, pictures, anything of that sort. So for example, in mental health, we may have an audio recording so that our learners can hear the tone of voice and begin to develop some of the skills about identifying if the tone of voice is congruent with what the patient is saying. But we may also include things, for example, the picture of the princess and the dragon, so we can see what the relationship is between things. We may also include, for example, the picture of the bridge or the terrain. And this might change the prince's mind about whether he actually wants to do this mission. So it's a way of actually including some complexity to the choices that students have to make. These kinds of add-ins are also helpful if we want to help students address bias. For example, we may have a very specific idea in our mind about what the prince looks like or who he is, when really it's just this green frog. So there's aspects about identifying bias that help us and challenge us to decide upon important interventions. I should also say that we have done some additional work with Simulation Canada with lab text, so including things like pictures of slides, pathology slides, and altering them so that students then have to identify what is different or abnormal about this slide. So these kind of add-ins can be really helpful to get at different components of learning. So this is an example of real-time chat sessions that we can embed in these scenarios. So when conversations arise that depend upon the nuances of the interaction, learners can chat via text with facilitators who assume the role of either like the patient or a colleague or whatever that might need to be. And then they receive a real-time response. So this all occurs as in real time as the student plays through the scenario. So during these conversations, then students are able to participate in how the scenario unfolds and the solutions that are created. So this is a dynamic process that requires students to formulate their own responses and use communication skills to adapt to unique circumstances of the situation. One of the ways that we have used this in nursing is to address some of those sensitive topics. For example, our novice nurses in addictions and mental health really struggle with doing risk assessments with their patient, asking about things like suicide, homicide, or self-harm. And so this is a way that they can start to formulate those questions that they find difficult in their own language. And I mean, I have never met a patient in my clinical practice that provides, multiple choice answers. So it's really important to be able to take the concepts that students learn in class and be able to kind of apply those in their own way in clinical practice. So the box titled, "You are entering a chat session," is what the learner sees. So you can see that the beginning of the conversation between the learner and the facilitator. And at the end of the conversation, facilitators can provide students with immediate feedback about their performance before they move on to the next section in the case. We've heard from learners that this is really important to them because they can incorporate the feedback from this particular chat session into additional chat sessions that they have throughout the scenario. So they're actually able to get the feedback while they're in the situation and have the opportunity to apply that as they go forward, versus getting to the end of the scenario, being immersed in their own evaluation of their performance while they're trying to also take in feedback and think about how they'll apply it. The picture with the 4 white columns is an example of the facilitator screen. So each column represents one learner and tracks the conversation between the learner and the facilitator. So across the top is where the student's or the learner's name is or number. We have done this both ways. And then the white column is where the conversation occurs. And then that little box above the blue button is where the facilitators type in their responses. So there are currently 8 of these columns across the screen. So we can potentially manage 8 students at once. Right now, when we have scenarios with real-time chat like this, our facilitators are generally able to handle 5 students at one time. We have experimented with staggered entry. So having some students enter and then 20 minutes later have another group of students enter. And this seems to work fairly well as well. So at the end of the scenario, students can save a copy of their transcript as well for further reflection. So then in Open Labyrinth, all of the students' answers to their questions that we ask, short answers, the transcripts from the chat sessions, they are all saved. And so students can download or save their transcript and then go back and look at this for further reflection. We have done this around motivational interviewing skills for our students, and the response and the learning has been really great. I've had students come back to me after they've graduated saying that this has been one of the best learning experiences in their program because they actually remembered it. They needed to go through their transcript and identify where they adhered to the model of motivational interviewing, where they didn't, and the impact that that had on patient outcomes. So another way that we have used virtual scenarios with these real-time chat sessions was developed when we had to rapidly shift to online learning due to COVID-19. So during May and June of 2020, the clinical practice for our nursing students at the University of Calgary was moved to online, and it was completely project-based. So this meant that there was minimal or no patient interaction. So in the addiction and mental health course, I had students create their own virtual patient simulations with these real-time chat sessions. So they chose the topic that they were interested in and had to relate the course content to that topic to build this. They developed their own learner outcomes. They created patient profiles and developed the narratives that occur here. And then they facilitated and played their completed scenarios with their peers and frontline healthcare providers. So all of these aspects of this activity contributed to a meaningful learning experience. And in the feedback, students said that this was the next best thing to actual clinical. So I think this was in part to because they had to consider the role of the nurse, but they also had to consider other perspectives such as the patient and educator as they developed these scenarios. So they had to have multiple perspectives. They also said that they learned additional skills from the frontline clinicians when they played their cases with them. So when they, for example, they learned how to pace interviews, they could develop a toolbox for how else to ask questions. They could observe clinical decision-making as the clinicians decided what information to pursue with the mock patient or the facilitator, and that these were valuable skills for the students. Students also said that when they played their peers' cases, they learned about topics that they may not have otherwise had the opportunity to learn about. Our instructor said it was also insightful to guide and coach students through this experience, and in particular to kind of review and collaborate on initial scripts, because it really highlighted where the learning gaps were for students. So this could be in terms of content, process of implementation, and other things like prioritization skills. So just before David talks about some of the analytics that are available, I briefly want to mention the technical requirements to develop and play the scenarios. So students use their own laptops, and they require a functional internet and a web browser. So usually Chrome or Firefox is preferred. So this means that students can access the scenarios wherever they have the technology and internet. So there's no need for dedicated space or specialized equipment. So David, would you like to talk about some of the analytics?
Sure. So thanks, Michelle. And you've described some of the ways in which we analyze user progress, etc. At this point, I will point out that this is more information to be aware of for future rather than to think about immediately as you're constructing your cases. But I would summarize it that Open Labyrinth tracks pretty much everything that your users do in the case. Every click, every response, every question, every talk statement, etc. Everything they do is tracked and time-stamped, so we know exactly who did what and when they did it. When we first developed Open Labyrinth, we thought, well, that might be useful, but who knows what, if we'll ever use that stuff. It has turned out to be very useful in a number of ways. Obviously, it can be very useful for looking at overall student performance and how they manage the cases and whether they're doing a good job. It's also helpful for group performance, how you can compare users across a group and stuff like that. For authors, where it has become particularly helpful is looking at how the case performs. You can use these measurements, these numbers, the tracking from this to look and see if the case is behaving as you would like. So one example is that you can look at the pathway that a user took through a case. And so sometimes that'll pick up on aberrant behaviors with learners if they're getting stuck or they don't understand something, or if they're not taking the case seriously. But what's also useful is that sometimes you see a group of users who all get stuck in the same area. And that's almost always because of something that we've overlooked in the case design, that we've missed a link, or we've made the next steps not obvious enough, or they just get lost, etc. And you could look at these pathways, and if people are locked in a little loop, it shows up very well graphically. That has turned out to be very useful in a number of ways. I spent last week just looking at some of the analytics from all our users on our servers, etc. And we've actually got a lot of data. We've got more than 25 million data points. So we're going to be writing those up in the next little while as to just how the OLAB is being used in different ways. The other way that I'll briefly touch upon, and again, rather than get into huge technical specifics, it's just useful to know that it is possible. We are able to track student or learner activities across our OLAB databases and other applications using something called a learning record store. This uses a protocol called XAPI, and it sends these little statements to this server. So again, it's a way of tracking who does what and when they do it. But it can be, information can be captured from multiple servers at once, or if you have more complex designs where you're using different tools, not just Open Labyrinth, it has a great potential. I won't go on further at this point, because to say that we're not expecting people to do a lot of that just now, but once you have your cases in use, it's very useful to be able to say to your funders, this case has been played this number of times, this is sort of the completion rate, that the students are happy, and all this kind of thing. So it's very useful to be able to pull those kind of analytics from OLAB. Thanks, Michelle. You're muted.
Está muteada, Michelle.
Thank you. So I just wanted to share an experience that we had last, I guess, March, where a student actually attempted, it was an assignment to do one of these scenarios, and they didn't do it, but they attempted to change the screen to indicate that they did. And so with the data that we can collect from the reports, it was very clear that that's exactly what the student did, was attempt to change the screen versus actually do the scenario. And so not that we have a lot of students that try to cheat, but in the event that those happen, that kind of data is really helpful. Okay, so I know you are all familiar with the importance of learner outcomes, but I bring these up because they really are the anchor point to the virtual scenario. So they provide direction for the type of branching narrative that you might use. They provide direction for the activities that you might choose to use to engage your learners, how you provide feedback, and they also inform the types of consequences that students may experience based on the choices within the scenario. So when we create a scenario template, these are just some guiding questions that have been helpful to decide on the structure or the type of branching narrative, as well as the various options for engaging your learners. So what do you want your learners to get out of the simulation? This is helpful to identify the parameters for the scenario. When will you start and end? How much time will you give the learners to complete the scenario? So one of the things that we noticed when students were creating their own is they developed an appreciation for how long a task would take. And even in terms of identifying the gaps in a process, going from point A to B and missing a bunch of steps. And so sometimes we need to think about that in terms of the length of the simulation. If there's too much information or too much to learn, you might just end up with an 8-hour simulation or virtual scenario, which you may have some disengagement at around hour 2. So what do learners already know? How will you activate learners' prior knowledge? So this is helpful to identify, for us to identify as teachers what our students' prior learning is and how we're going to activate that. So what kinds of questions or activities do we need to do to actually bring that previous learning forward? I mean, in my experience, sometimes students might learn something in first year or like the term before, but it ends up getting put kind of in the recess of the knowledge bank. And sometimes we need to ask a question to actually bring that forward and help them begin to make connections between that previous learning and what we're asking them to do now, or the role of the professional. What connections do you want learners to make between prior knowledge and emerging knowledge? So this is helpful because it helps to determine which learning activities are best suited to the level of complexity. So for example, how a facilitator responds in a chat session and what point of view the learners need to consider. One of the scenarios that our students developed is around domestic violence. And so it was difficult initially for them to think about how would the patient respond to this type of question. And so it's really important then that the closer the language is to the real context, the easier it is for the learner to assume the role. And when we have learners actively buying into the situation and assuming that professional role, then we have a higher degree of affective learning as well. And then what other skills might learners need? So it's important to consider what other skills they need and also how they're going to acquire those. So can these skills be acquired, or how are these skills acquired in the real world? And can that be mimicked in this scenario? And that kind of drives kind of how your scenario unfolds. So I really want to emphasize the importance of creating the script before you begin putting the information into Open Labyrinth, the platform. I find having like a Word document works best, where each page in the Word document corresponds to a screen in the scenario or an activity. And I find that this is helpful because we get to see the whole script at a glance, as opposed to looking at it page by page. And it's easier to make mass edits, so we can spell check the entire simulation at once. And we can move around big parts or lots of parts at one time. So ultimately, it just becomes a bit more time efficient if we create the script before we start putting it into Open Labyrinth. So these are just some additional resources. And I think I'll pause here. And we'll answer any questions, and then I can show you what a script might look like, and then we can do a little demonstration for what this might look like in Open Labyrinth as well. So are there any questions about that information?
Por mi parte, no, tengo todo claro hasta el momento.
Sí, bastante claro, muchas gracias. Yo solo me salta la duda, pero sé que lo vamos a ver. Cuando hablas de guión, se refiere al caso más todas las decisiones que tiene que tomar el estudiante. Eso es completamente, digamos, ¿cierto? Es todo. Okay. Yes.
Great question. And yes, that is what I'm referring to.
Yo quería preguntar, porque me queda el concepto del conocimiento previo, de cómo activar el conocimiento previo en algunas asignaturas, principalmente en las que nosotros realizamos, son asignaturas del primer semestre, de alumnos que recién ingresan a la universidad. Entonces ahí quizás va a ser un poco más difícil el activar ese conocimiento previo, porque quizás no lo van a tener, o ahí tendríamos que escudriñar en el conocimiento previo del colegio, de la secundaria. Eso es como lo que veo un poco, me cuesta quizás aterrizarlo después al caso. Ese era como el comentario, pero el resto bien.
Yeah, just about that prior knowledge piece. So some of our students, for example, will take like a communications course first, and then they will start their nursing courses, and we talk about assessment. And so some of that prior knowledge would be bringing forward some of that communication stuff they might have learned in another course. Like, what is an open-ended question? Why are those better questions than closed-ended questions in certain situations? The other way that we deal with that is sometimes these scenarios are like middle to late part of the course. And so we are asking them to start kind of thinking about how the information has combined so that we can have some type of summative learning at the end of the course. Okay. So one second. There we go. Do you guys see this script? There's an English column and a Spanish column. Is that what you guys see? Yes, okay. So this is a short version of what a script might look like. And so this story part, we would generally call this background information. So this is where we get students to start thinking is what's the situation like and what contributes to that situation? So like prior health history, maybe it's the context, so the setting that the sample comes from, things like this. And then we start to get them to think about what their learner outcomes are and what kinds of questions do you want to ask, right? So then we start, this would be an example of kind of the question, the responses and rationales that I think you had asked about before that would be included in the script. So this is very short based on the princess case that we did in the presentation. Obviously for other scenarios, these are much longer. And it generally works best if we are putting like the background information on one page and then the current context. So where are they starting? Are they just coming to work and they're being presented with this sample they have to analyze? So to really set the current context for where they are. And then the questions and for example, if we were to choose, if we were to go back up to here in this first question, so this area right here, and let's say the learner chose answer B. You cannot rescue his daughter because you don't want to die. So this would be the wrong answer. We can, well, it might be the right answer, but for now it's the wrong answer. And we can actually set them on a totally different path. So, you know, where we start asking questions, well, you know, if you don't do this, you're going to be ostracized in the kingdom. And how are you going to, you know, pay for groceries and whatnot if no one's going to hire you? And so we can actually get them to start exploring the consequences of that choice. And then once they get to the point where they realize that this is probably not the best choice and that there are dire consequences here, we give them the opportunity to go back to this question and try the other answer and to go forward with that path. And then in this way, they begin to start thinking about the comparisons between the two answers and contextually why one would be right or the other. So when we do this as a Word document, it's easy if I choose the wrong answer here to say, go to page 8. And then once I've played through all the consequences for this wrong answer, at the end of that to say, go back to page 2, which is where this question would be. So when we put it in a Word document, we can kind of see how it all flows. It's like a choose your own adventure book, kind of. Okay. So that's kind of the script and the gist of the script. So I think, David, are you able to play through Cheryl a bit?
Yep, I can do that.
Okay. So I will just share my screen and then we'll flip to David and he can share. So this here, make sure I have the right. So do you guys see the screen that says welcome to Open Labyrinth? And I apologize that this is in English.
Yep.
Okay. All right. So this would be the screen that the learner would see when they first log into Open Labyrinth. And then I will get out of here. And David, do you want to share your screen?
All right, here we go.
And can you make it a bit bigger, please?
Yep. Hang on a second. Just try that again. There we go. That better?
Thank you. So what we do for some of our courses where we have multiple virtual scenarios or cases, we will create a scenario. And so we will put multiple cases. It's like a folder. And we will put all our cases in here. And then we have the ability to open and lock them as we need them or as the student goes to play. So it's a way that we can kind of cluster our cases, so to speak.
So I would, as the student, I would come into this, and the first case, or the only case that's available just now to me is Cheryl. So I would click on the green play button, and this will take me into the Cheryl case. Did you want to walk through this, Michelle, or shall I?
It doesn't matter.
So
go ahead.
That's the very simple introductory, the context material, who you are, where you are, what you're going to be doing, etc. And there's a note to the students that they are going to be doing some Turk Talk stuff, flagged by that little yellow icon. They would then move into looking at the client's profile. And again, apologies, that's fairly dense text and hard to, and all in English, but it's just basically talking about Cheryl, who's a 27-year-old teacher, and she has a marijuana problem. And she's been caught smoking in the parking lot at school, and so is being hauled up to deal with this. We would then move on into the case study, and it gives a bit more information specifically about what's happening. That Cheryl's been getting up 2 hours early to smoke marijuana before work. And you then look at some of the contributing factors that might be at play where, so this is where we're asking for a series of questions. And if you want to describe that, Michelle, I think you do that better than I do.
Okay, so the purpose of this case is for students to eventually have a conversation with Cheryl using what they've learned about motivational interviewing to develop a back to work plan with Cheryl. So one of the first things we're doing here to activate their knowledge is to activate knowledge about marijuana. So what has contributed to her smoking marijuana? So for example, we might say decreased coping skills. That's one of the options here. So it's the second from the top, if you want to click on that, David. Now, this is an example of the dandelion I talked about, where it's a select all that apply, but we have more lengthy explanations and rationales. So decreased coping skills, here we would say that's correct. And we would help that student make the connection between decreased coping skills and a substance use or addiction problem. And so we would then provide some additional information to help them make that connection. And then the list is still there, so they can continue to select all of the items that they think are contributing factors to developing for marijuana use or addiction. So David clicks high stress. And in this particular context, that is not the correct answer. So it would say no, and it would provide the students with a rationale, about why that answer is incorrect. And then redirect them to additional learning. At any point, the student can decide that they are done with this learning. They don't want to go through the rest of the list because they know it all, or they're bored, or whatever the idea might be. And they can click done with contributing factors. So then the other piece of information that they need to know is what is motivational interviewing? And so this question really kind of gets it. What is motivational interviewing? What is the role of the nurse? And so they can again click on all that apply. So David, feel free to click on any of them. So this is motivational interviewing is collaborative, and it gives them a rationale and indicates it's the correct answer. So we'll move on from this. And this is an example of a multiple choice question where there's only one right answer. So this is just asking the student to identify where they would start in the interview. According to motivational interviewing, the very first thing we want to do is ask what is good about smoking marijuana. We want to start by engaging the patient and finding out what's good about this habit. So David said, the first thing we would do is what do you enjoy? And that is the correct answer. And it gives a brief rationale about why that's correct. Do you want to click on another one just for fun? So if they clicked on C, it would tell them that this is the wrong answer. And again, a brief rationale. So they can go through all these answers as a way to direct their learning. We cannot provide the answers here, and this can become part of a cumulative score that the students could receive at the end of this case as well. Okay, so if we're done with this, we move on to the first real-time chat session. So we call these Turk Talk, but what that really means is just a real-time chat session. So this is what the learner would see, and David is going to be the student nurse, and he's going to start interacting with the facilitator, who is going to be me, and I'm role-playing Cheryl. So he says hello. So David was very therapeutic and said, how are you today? And I, as the patient, because I'm frustrated, I don't want to be here, I actually just said, I don't really want to talk to you. So how long will this take? So this is not necessarily an abnormal response from our patient. And this is what I mean about keeping the language really close to what the scenario might be. And so now David is being very therapeutic, and he says, as long as you like or have time for. And so as you can see, there's a running kind of list of the conversation here. So as this list gets longer, you can scroll back and forth to kind of review what you've said. And that's kind of how this works. So maybe I'll show you what this looks like from the facilitator end. So this is what the facilitator sees. And these are all the columns of all the different students. And this pink one, as you can see, is David. These would be other students who would be playing the case simultaneously. So I can follow along with theirs. So just to orientate you to this screen a little bit, when the conversation gets long, we have these scroll bars so we can go back and forth. These colored bars across the top, this goes from green to yellow to red. So if I have multiple users, I can see which one I need to respond to first as a way to help me prioritize. This part here is where the student name is. And this highlighted blue box down here is where I type my response. So I might say, can I leave now then? So I would type it in and then it would populate into the conversation column. These kind of buttons along the side here, when we talked about the analytics and being able to evaluate kind of student responses, when we do this, we recognize that there are some just responses that students use all the time. So for example, hi, how are you today? So if that's a common thing. So I may have, these boxes along here are responses that I can have to those common questions. So I'm not constantly retyping the same thing, right? So I would just highlight my box and I could pick whichever response was appropriate and it populates in the box. I hit submit and it automatically comes up and populates for the learner. So this is one way that we can manage multiple conversations at once while addressing the common responses across learners. Any questions about these screens? Okay.
Esa comunicación es entre el profesor y el estudiante, no es entre estudiantes, ¿cierto?
Well, so it's between the learner or the student and a facilitator. And these facilitators, in our experience, like with nursing, we have had multiple types of facilitators. So it's not only the instructor, because there's only one of me and sometimes 100 in my class. And so these have sometimes been frontline clinicians who come to volunteer with expertise in the area about how to respond, for example. We've also had students who have gone through these cases and graduated. And that's one of the cool things about this is I have never really had a problem getting facilitators because these students who play this, they like it so much that they email me and say, hey, Michelle, are you doing those again? Can I come volunteer as a facilitator? And so I think that that's kind of a unique situation to be in where we don't have to recruit. We have had alumni be facilitators from our faculties, but we have also had senior students facilitate junior students. And I think the cool thing when it comes to clinicians, senior students, previous students, is there's lots of learning going on for the learner. But for our facilitators, I'm getting comments and feedback like, you know, this really had me think about my practice differently, about the kinds of questions I ask, or, you know, the perspective of the patient differently, because they have to assume this different role. And so it's interesting. It's kind of like a little refresher course almost for the, you know, that they do on their own as they play through this for our clinicians and our facilitators. And it's going to be an interesting study.
One of the things which has been interesting is that we talk about having a script, but it's not like a script for a play. You don't have to get the words exactly right. You describe for the facilitator, here are your issues, here are the things that stress you, here is your personality, you are irritable, grumpy, or something like that. After that, that is all they need to run with it, because the exact wording of the responses matters way less than the style of how it's said. And we find that trainee facilitators pick up on that very, very quickly. And for the student, it's also not crucial for the response to be exact. It's real life. A patient isn't necessarily going to give you a perfect response, so you need to be able to adapt to that.
And I think even when we're talking about using this to help students interact with equipment and specimens and things like that, I think that it's helpful because what you present in the picture or the text or whatever is not aligning necessarily with the sanitized example from the textbook, right? It's real life, there's deviations in it. And so part of the learning is about tapping into that unpredictable nature that we encounter as we're in clinical practice. David and I have also done some analysis around, does the quality of the facilitator matter? And this was interesting because there's a component of that unpredictability that is actually enriching the learning. We found that wasn't a huge, like the quality of the facilitator was not so much a huge part of the outcome or contributor to the learning. It was more about staying roughly in character and those aspects of unpredictability that the student needs to respond to.
So a number of you are instructors at earlier levels of students or things that are not clinical. We have used the same approach for teaching people in technical support roles. So for instance, you give a scenario where a user is having a problem with a particular application which is crashing all the time, and you put them into, you are now tech support, how are you going to respond to that? And you can look at things like, so the technical support trainee says, well, you just have to reboot the session. And the poor learner is going, I have no idea what that means. And so they have to figure out ways to rephrase it so that it's not a case of powering down the whole computer or all that, just dealing with the issues that arise. And the facilitator can play the various levels of user, from the grumpy old man who really doesn't want to do any of this to somebody who is really struggling even to know how to turn the computer on. That you can dial up or down the level of expertise of the user and make them think their way through the problem. It isn't just a clinical training situation.
Mm-hmm. So we've also been able to use this in situations where learners need to analyze data or use equipment, and there's a problem with the equipment. How are they going to solve that problem? Or, having to solve problems in settings that they're not familiar with. So for example, some of our nurses are in hospitals, but when they go to a rural setting, they may not have the same resources. So how are you going to solve the problem with different resources? So those are some of the other examples that we have used this for. Any other questions? Okay. So I think I'm going to show you what a map looks like. So once we have our script and we start to put it into Open Labyrinth, I'm going to share with you what that looks like and to kind of go through some of the simple steps of getting started with that. Okay, so as we mentioned, this is what you will see, both the learner and you as instructors when you develop your cases. This is what you'll see when you log in. So the case that we were just playing, David added a fun name, Cheryl's in the Weeds, just to highlight we're managing marijuana. So this is what a map would look like. So this would be the introduction to the case. This is the background information, et cetera, et cetera. This big hot mess right here, this is the dandelion I was talking about, where we have multiple choices. So this contributing factors box here is the stem of the question, and each of these boxes around here are the different answers with the rationale. How we get to this is we have tools that will actually build this matrix for you so that you can just then populate the boxes. Adding all these arrows yourself is more than just daunting. So know that you don't have to do that. And so how this then progresses is they could choose one of these answers, but then still be able to select from the remainder. And then it all funnels them down here to the done with the contributing factors, and we can move on to the next aspect of the case. So over here in this box, when I'm scrolling through, this is kind of the larger visual of what the map looks like. So once you have your script and it's all spell checked, then it becomes fairly easy to cut and paste those responses or your text into each of these boxes. So we would click on the box and then we can just enter here, copy and paste the text. To get started, to make one of these maps, we would go to Labyrinths, and then we can create it using simple steps, or we can create it manually. David, did you want to continue from this point? Is David there?
I'm here. Sorry,
okay.
Just making some notes about the. Sorry, I missed the question.
That's okay. I was just wondering if you want to explain if we are going to create a map. I can do it if you'd like. It doesn't matter.
Go ahead and I'll jump in if I need to.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, so again, we're going to go to Labyrinths, and for this one, we're going to create this manually, but you can also have a step-by-step guided one as well. So it's going to just ask you for some basic information, Labyrinth title, So I'll just put in the example for Chile workshop. In this box, we can add a description. So, you know, kind of the particular skill we want them to work on. So we might want to say developing a map. And then keywords so that we can do quick searches. We do not need to worry about the timing section. This labyrinth security right here, we suggest that you start with private so that only the people creating the case have access to this and that people aren't kind of seeing your work as it's in progress. And then we're going to select create labyrinth. So from here, this just is a kind of an overview of some of the information you've put in. From here, we want to go along to the side to these options, and we're going to select visual editor. And that brings us to this map page. So here you're given an initial or root node. So this is where the case will start. So we can give this particular box or node a title. We might just say start for now. And then I might type in my instructions. Or from my script, I would copy and paste whatever instructions or information I wanted to give the learners. We suggest you save your changes as you go. No one likes to lose their data. Not necessary, but suggested. Okay, from this node, we call them nodes, but in essence, it's a box. There are two symbols. They kind of look the same. This one here looks like a target on the top, and this one on the bottom is a plus sign. So to add boxes, we're just going to hit the plus sign. So this might be the next one where we have kind of, you know, our first question for learners, and then we would cut and paste from our Word document, maybe our the first question or the initial data information we want to share. Again, we save questions. We could add another box. We can title this consequence. Number 1, maybe we have more than one consequence. And again, we would just cut and paste our data, our information into here. Now let's say straight off the bat, after this first question, I have 2 consequences, or I needed to add some other options here. I'm going to add the box, and the second box appears and it's already connected. So now when they get to this first question, they have 2 options. And okay, so I'm just going to add a box here, and we're going to label it keep going for now. So this would be how one of the options progresses in this particular pathway. So let's say this is the wrong option from the prints. So I've said, no way, I don't want to die. I'm not going to do this. So then we kind of lead them along and get them to think about the implications of that choice. But we want them to be able to go back and to have an opportunity to retry this again, right? Or to choose the second option. So to do that, we click on the target, and it creates a new kind of arrow, and we just drag and drop that to connect it to the next box. Okay. Let's say this arrow is going in the wrong direction. So we can click on the arrow, and we can change the direction of this box, of this arrow back this way. Let's say we want them to be able to go back and forth between these boxes. We can create a dual arrow, which allows them to go back and forth between the boxes. And then we just continue to add our nodes or our boxes and ensure our arrows are going in the right way as we go along. There are ways to, and then we're going to save our work. There are some other options along here. For example, this questions one. So this is a way that we can create multiple choice questions. And then we can also, once these questions are created, we can copy them into other cases. So you're not having to recreate the questions. So it's a way that we can actually make our work more efficient. So we can add a question. And this is where I was referring to the pick choice, which is a single choice, multiple choice, or the multiple choice, which is select all that apply. And then this Turk Talk, this is our real-time chat session. So you can select from whatever type of question you want to create. So let's just do a basic one. So I selected the type of question, which is a pick choice, which is highlighted here, one right answer. And in here, I'm going to type the stem of my question. So, are dragons magical? So here I have the option. This is where I would choose, do I want them to see the answer when they select it? I would choose show or do not show. I can change how the answers are laid out, et cetera, et cetera. So to put in my responses to this, I would come down here to add responses, and I would just start my responses. So A, this would be yes. And then this feedback, this is where I would give the feedback. So I would say, correct. They are beautiful creatures or something. Whatever your rationale is. And in this correctness, this is actually where, and this score, this is where we can actually indicate. So we would choose that this is the correct answer. And then if we wanted to assign grades to these questions, because we can make this like a formative assessment, I could choose, they get 1 point for selecting the right answer. Okay, so now I'm going to add my response B, which is, whoops, a little too many there. My response B, which is no. Incorrect. You can say we can say nope, they are no different than princesses. That might be our rationale. So then here we would say that this is incorrect. And we could assign 0 marks for this if this is what they chose. Okay. We would save our changes. And we would notice that we would get this little code right here. So this is how we can maybe, if we want to add this question to any labyrinth, we could go, or any scenario, we will select this code, we will copy it, and then we can go back to our visual editor. We would select where we want that question to go, and we would just paste the question there. Save our changes. So now if I were to play this scenario, I can come back here and play as the author. This is my very first start button with my instructions. I'm going to go to my first question. Are dragons magical? I can choose no, and it'll say incorrect. It'll give me why, or I can choose yes, and it will show me the answer as well. So then I can go into either consequence 1 or that other box that we didn't label, which is actually consequence 2. And then I can just play through this. And then this new node would be still the option to choose consequence 2 from our map. Okay. Questions about that process?
Sí, mi pregunta es, ¿qué pasa cuando el estudiante elige la respuesta incorrecta primero y después elige la correcta? ¿Qué pasa con el puntaje? ¿Solamente se asigna cuando acierta la primera vez o se asigna de todas formas?
That's a great question. So when we are doing like formative assessments or summative assessments, it really kind of depends on your assessment. So normally it would take the first answer. You can set this up. So it can take the first answer or their second try, or we can assign no answer at all, like no score to it at all. And it can just strictly be kind of learning as they go. for those dandelions, that big hot mess where they have multiple selections with significant rationales, or select all that apply. If I am assigning grades to those, I normally do kind of a right minus wrong type of situation, because this deters learners from just selecting all the answers and getting marks for the right answers. They actually have to think about, is the answer correct? Because if I select a wrong answer, that is going to be subtracted from my score of the right answers. Did that answer your question? Okay. I have done quizzes in Open Labyrinth with my students. And I think part of the beauty, if we look at this map, is we can actually move these around. So if all of these boxes go with one question and this box goes with another, I can start to cluster these. So let's say I have another answer to this question. I'll just make a new box. If this was like a quiz within this scenario, and all of these questions, like I don't know, 2 or 3 questions about the same topic, I can choose that I'm only going to ask maybe this question and this question. And how I would do that then is I would just remove these links. So I click on the arrow, I'd go delete and apply, and see how it's no longer connected. And so from a learner perspective, I haven't deleted my question. So from a learner's perspective, then they only get access, to these 3 questions, which means every time I offer this course, I can switch up which questions I ask, which in some respects maintains the integrity of your question bank, although students still screenshot the questions. But it's not going to be the same questions every time you might have this quiz part of the scenario. Any other questions?
Ahí en ese sentido, entonces, una plantilla que se arme de secuencia de preguntas va a ser siempre el mismo para todos los estudiantes, digamos, si yo lo defino. ¿Cierto?
Yes.
O sea, okay. Y cuando usted hablaba de analítica, de extraer información, de cómo les ha ido a los estudiantes, ¿es por cada pregunta, por cada recuadro en el fondo que yo puedo tener la información, o es por la ruta completa del estudiante solamente?
David, would you like to speak to that question?
Okay.
Sure. It depends a little bit on how complex the case is and how crucial those decisions are. Generally, we find that when mapping out your initial design or your initial script, it's more describing the problem that you want to tackle. If you are expecting a staff member to do that transcription of the case material into OLAB for you, then they will generally need more detail. But it's not crucial to do it one way or the other, because you can go back and use the visual editor as a tool to construct your map. You can use it as like a working document as you go. You don't have to get every detail right in the script to start with. Does that make sense?
Sí, y entonces, en ese sentido, ahí también es posible que uno tolere que un estudiante se equivoque en una pregunta y siga hacia adelante, diga, siga con otras decisiones, me imagino también, ¿cierto?
Correct, yes. And again, that's we've had very few cases where you completely stop the student from progressing until they get it right, because they just get frustrated. So you might give them feedback in some ways. You might give them a whole bunch of minus points. You might just within the text of the next page go, that really wasn't the smartest idea because the patient and his wife are going to be really annoyed with you. Tell them what would happen and then continue with the case as if they'd done the right thing. So there's various ways in which you can take that. But yeah, stopping them from progressing, that it just makes them cross. It can be done though. The nice thing about OLAB is that its design allows you to be as rigid or directed or as free or as flexible as you want. There is nothing within the program design which constrains that. So we do have some courses where that is important to be more accurate, and others which are much more flexible. And OLAB accommodates all of those teaching styles.
Other questions? Are you having some thoughts about how this might be useful for what you're working on? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Ah, está bien, está bien. Solo pensando en el análisis de los datos, cuando menciona que se puede extraer la información, eso es exportable a un archivo Excel, texto, y uno puede hacer estadística fuera, ¿cierto? ¿Eso es así?
Yes.
Okay.
If you have a case where you're actually assigning grades and those grades become part of the student's overall grade, like as an assignment, for example, you can also get a report of what the student's grades are in an Excel and be able to import those into different types of learning management systems. So you can incorporate it into your grade book as well, if you choose to assign grades. Do you have any thoughts about how this might be helpful for what you're working on?
Me parece interesante como un proceso formativo en cuanto estábamos conversando sobre el que el estudiante no acerte a la primera, ¿cierto? A la respuesta correcta. Entonces, eso para él como un proceso formativo previo, por ejemplo, una evaluación final, sería súper útil, porque como hablaba David, no se frustra el estudiante si no responde correctamente a la primera, al primer intento, llamémoslo así. Así que se me ocurren algunas ideas como tratar de aplicar el ejercicio.
I think there is opportunity as well, like if they get the wrong answer, to be able to include resources for them to go and review. So there's that opportunity too, and that they could use this independently to prepare for other tests, assignments, whatever, because they can access it on their own time. You're right, it's not something that is kind of contained to the classroom environment. Sorry, Pablo, were you going to say something?
Sí, bueno, por distintos aspectos que habíamos conversado previamente, sí, este estilo de laberinto, estos mapas que uno puede armar son bastante útiles para asociar muchas veces estructuras, funciones desde el punto de vista celular. Y en el caso de los que vemos bioquímica, en que nosotros ya empezamos a aplicar un poco casos clínicos muy simples, pero este tipo de escenario es ideal. porque además uno puede estar dando el feedback o lo que tú mismo decías recién, uno puede agregar elementos, si falló, mira, anda a ver este video y tú vas a poder aclarar este concepto y después vuelves. Entonces, eso le da una retroalimentación además y un diagnóstico al propio alumno. Él después de esto sabe realmente si está bien o está mal, si todo lo que estudió le sirvió o en realidad le falta. Entonces, es una herramienta también diagnóstica, de autodiagnóstico, y es bastante interesante.
And some of those resources, like the video, if they need to watch a video to kind of learn something, they can click on a link in the scenario, go and watch the video without actually leaving the scenario, and then come back and continue with the learning of the scenario.
Sí, interesante. Cuando uno está en una sala o está en una actividad, la plataforma soporta un número importante de estudiantes, o la idea es que más bien sobre un mismo caso estoy pensando, ¿es posible o tiene que hacerlo asincrónico idealmente? ¿Cómo es eso? No sé si me expliqué.
So just to clarify, are you, oh, okay. Just to clarify then, are you asking if you can do these like synchronously, like in the classroom, or assign it for students to do by themselves in their own time?
Sí. Las dos cosas. ¿Cómo funciona? ¿Mejor sincrónico? ¿Sincrónico es posible ambos? O
Okay, I'm not sure I'm understanding. But for all the students to do it at the same time?
sí, es posible. Claro, si yo tengo un curso de 40 estudiantes, ¿puedo yo entrar al caso y funciona bien esta plataforma con una situación como esa? Eso. Sorry.
Yeah, no. No, it's all good. So yes, they can all do it at the same time, or they can do it independently. I think part of the beauty is that there's not a lot of copying, because it's so independent upon what they choose, right? The other alternative that we have done is we have done this in where students work on a case as a group. And so I think, David, do you want to speak to that? Because you had some really great things to say about using OLAB with group work.
So one of the ways that we found OLAB to be quite useful for, again, it works best with more experienced learners for professional development, for senior students, etc. But if you give them the right decision points and encouragement that this can be done, it can work at all levels. But that is to give them a case where there is not necessarily a perfect answer. Give them something where there are several different options about how a problem can be solved. All of them are potentially correct, but some are better than others. And then use that, not dilemma, but that contentiousness, that uncertainty as a stimulus for discussion. So they could discuss it through just like an online forum, or they can discuss it in a live group, or on Zoom as we are. But to give them the idea that there is not just a single answer. An awful lot of the quizzes and exams that we set for students, there is a perfect answer, and you have to figure out which are all the distractors. Well, that's not real life. In real life, you have a situation, what you want to do, and there might be 4 or 5 things which are reasonable, but some are better than others. And so you have to figure out which is better and which is not. Sometimes the students get a bit thrown off by that, because they want to know what the perfect answer is. And you have to change their thinking around to, in real life, a little man is not going to jump out with a little red flag and go, no, that's wrong. If you make a choice, things continue And you then have to deal with the consequences, what is good and what is not so good of that. And it's really good for getting people to debate situations where, well, but if you do this, then this is going to happen, and the patient would have to get sent to such and such, or if we go this way, it gets them thinking much more about the subtleties and consequences of that decision. It's a much richer technique, but in doing that, you also have to encourage learners, this is not a guess what the perfect answer is. This is thinking through a decision process.
Super.
And I think one of the ways that works well is like a discussion board activity, where students can then post, responses to questions on a discussion board. In terms of even as a teacher or instructor, thinking about how we evaluate and assign grades for assignments. So things like, kind of assigning marks to the questions and getting a total for that, discussion board activities, printing out a transcript like in smaller classes and having them, like I said, with the motivational interviewing scenario, the students had to look through their transcript and identify where they adhered or did not adhere to the model and the implication for patient care or outcomes were. And so there are different ways to incorporate assessment and gradable activities, I guess, into this mode of learning as well.
Disculpa, y esos diálogos entre los estudiantes tiene que hacerse por Zoom o por alguna otra plataforma, ¿cierto? O dentro del Open Labyrinth hay alguna manera que ellos interaccionen en un chat o algo así, no sé. Sí, se entiende.
Do you mean in the real-time chat sessions or in terms of additional conversation?
No, cuando trabajan, por ejemplo, estudiantes en grupo, 4 o 5 estudiantes que trabajan en grupo, ellos para dialogar entre ellos sobre el caso, lo pueden hacer por Zoom o por otra, eso es la idea, ¿no? O dentro de la plataforma.
We did build a discussion forum into OLAB, and it does link to particular cases. Very few groups use that because it's not a very good discussion forum. We usually find that it is better just to link it to whatever you're already using.
Ok. Gracias. Y la otra pregunta es, cuando es posible que uno le asigne tiempos, le cuenta el caso, pero responder las preguntas tiene un tiempo, pensando en una situación que tiene que responder rápido a una situación de emergencia, por ejemplo. ¿Se puede incluir eso?
Yes, you can. So there is a mechanism called timed pop-ups or pop-up messages. And so you can set for any particular node or a section of nodes, you can give them an expiry time. And what happens when that time expires is it may just pop up a message which warns them, or it will actually force a jump in the case. Your time is up, you have run out of time, and it'll force them to move onwards to another node in the case. So you can do it either way.
These are great questions.
And that timer works differently for, so if you have several people playing the case at once, each one of them will have their own timer.
I will be right back.
Any other questions about? Yeah, these have been really good questions. I'd love to see your cases as you develop them. Open Labyrinth is very powerful. It allows you to do a lot of things. And for many things, there are more than one way to achieve it. So as you're putting together your thinking and your designs and you're struggling to think about how to do something, don't hesitate to contact us, because there is a very big user manual, but it can sometimes be quite frustrating to figure those things out. Whereas a quick 5-minute email, how do I get this to happen this way, etc., and we can give you some suggestions.
Muchas gracias.
You're welcome.
Yo tengo una duda un tanto más práctica, porque estuve mirando la plataforma un poco antes de la reunión y para poder inscribirse salía una serie de opciones de universidades de Canadá y uno podía inscribir en la propia institución, pero había que conseguir un permiso y hasta ahí llegué con el formulario. Entonces, saber si eso no es problema, cualquiera puede llegar ahí e inscribirse para utilizar la plataforma.
I'm not quite sure what permit you're referring to. So for anybody in this project, for creating your own cases, we're happy to lend our server, so that you guys can get going on this. There is no cost to that. And it's even though it's a demo account, but it has all the things that it's not limited in any way. Because it's a demo server, we don't recommend it for high stakes exams and stuff like that, because we can't guarantee that the server is always working. It's always under development, etc. But there is no cost to that. In the first session, one of the faculty was talking about setting up your own server down in Chile, and again, there is no cost doing that, but that's something which does need a little bit of technical expertise, somebody who knows how to set up web servers. So I think the plan is for the project to set up such a server sometime in the next few months. The nice thing is that the case materials that you create just now on our server are easy to move across to your server at any point. You don't lose things in the transition.
And prior to our session today, I did set up usernames and logins. So
I believe there's a dog for sale.
I think he wants to play a scenario, but anyway, the joys of working from home. So anyway, I did set up usernames and IDs, and Open Labyrinth should have sent you a message with that. So please check your junk mail. Otherwise, I can post that stuff in the chat. I gave everyone the same ID to begin with, and then you can go and change that to something that's more specific to you. So if that's helpful, I can put that in the chat right now, if that would be helpful for you.
Sí, yo en el chat, si pudiera, sería ideal.
Sí, yo lo recibí el correo.
Ah, yo no.
No.
Okay, I will do that right now. So did you receive yours? Okay. So
Okay.
for the participants this morning, I'm not sure the best way to send them theirs either. I can email them all to someone, maybe just some guidance on how you would like to move forward with that. So I'm just going to put my email in the chat as well. So if you have questions, you can email me. And David, if you want to do the same, maybe. Okay.
I apologize for leaving my camera off most of the time. The bandwidth out here where I am is not brilliant. And so sometimes if I'm running video, it slows things down for everybody. So I tend to leave the camera off.
Sí, no hay problema. A nosotros nos pasa lo mismo.
So if there's any other questions, you can feel free to email us. I think that these sound like very exciting learning opportunities in areas of science. I think that's pretty cool.
Sí. En el caso de que uno idear un proyecto interno, un proyecto de innovación educativa, ahí me imagino que la plataforma para un grupo de estudiantes de un par de asignaturas en un par de sedes, no sé, 100 estudiantes, una cosa así, es posible conseguir o tener en algún minuto el acceso para ellos, ¿cierto? Eso lo podemos pensar como posible, ¿no? Ok.
Yes. Yep. Generally, how we sign up users, it's the same for you as authors as it is for students, and just requires like an email address and their name.
Okay.
There are some more sophisticated ways that we can tie into platforms like Moodle later on if we need to. So depending on if we're getting lots of users, there are ways that we can do this, and we can explore that with your technical people.
Well, we can stay for a few more minutes. We have some time left if you want to talk about your projects or have any other questions. If not, then we're free to go as well.
Yo creo que estamos con la información y tendremos que conversar ahí con Karen y con Pablo para planear lo que habíamos conversado en algo de bioquímica, biología o alguna otra cosa, pero yo creo que por ahora estábamos muy agradecidos por toda la información y la muy buena orientación, así que muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias.
Sí. Gracias por la información.
Sí, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Most welcome.
Muchísimas gracias, Michelle, David, Pamela, Luis, y también a nuestros colegas Karen, Luis y Pablo. les deseamos que tengan una muy buena tarde y como tarde en Canadá, ¿o no? No, en mediodía tienen que ir a almorzar. Un abrazo grande a todos. Muchísimas gracias y seguimos en contacto.
Muchas gracias. Gracias a todos.
Muchas gracias. Chao, chao, que estén bien. Chao,
Chao,
chao.
chao.
Aquí
Thank
también
you.
vamos a
Thank you
almorzar.
all. Great questions.
Chao.
Bye-bye now.
Chao.
Hello. I'm wondering how you want me to get the rest of the user IDs and passwords that I set up for the participants from the morning. Do you just want me to email those to you and you can distribute them, or what would you prefer?
¿A mí, Paola, o a Luis? Yo creo que a Luis en el equipo.
Está hablando, yo creo, de los agentes de veterinaria, Michelle, me parece, que está hablando del grupo anterior.
Ah.
Sí.
El grupo anterior es mejor hablar directamente con María Paz y en este grupo con Luis, porque ellos saben quiénes son las personas que van en su grupo.
Sí, acá ya,
Pero
ya
yo
la
también,
tenemos.
¿sí?
Okay.
También puedo hacer de intermediaria si necesitan.
Okay, so I think what I'll do then is I'll just send the full list of usernames and passwords to Maria, and then she can distribute those and our emails for additional questions, and we can go from there. Okay.
Sí, perfecto.
Okay, great. Well, I hope you guys have a great day. Thanks for having us.
Sí, muchas gracias. Chao.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.